It's 1 p.m., and I call the board to order. Pursuant to Policy 1.400, the board meeting policy, our board workshops are meetings of the board as a committee of the whole. You may recall that this requires us to begin our proceedings in a more formal way. Mr. Casey Griffin on our staff will call the roll to determine if we have a quorum for the record.
Mr. Cobbins.
Here.
Mr. Darnell.
Here.
Mr. Eby.
Here.
Mr. Edwards.
Here.
Mr. Ferguson.
Here.
Ms. Kim.
Here.
Ms. Tucker.
Here.
Ms. Hartgrove.
Here,
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
we have a quorum and we are duly convened. Without objection and pursuant to Policy 1.400, Section 8, I now resolve that the board into a meeting of the Committee of the Whole for the purpose of conducting our workshop. Before we move into the agenda, I want to, first of all, recognize Senator Joey Hensley, who is here with us today. Thank you for joining us. I am also pleased to welcome our new Commissioner of Education, Dr. Penny Schwinn. She is joining us for the first time, and I want to tell you that we look forward to working with you and are delighted to have you here for your very first workshop. And if you have any remarks, this would be the great time to do it.
Well, thank you so much, Madam Chairman, and the board. It was nice to meet all of you in the last 5 or 6 minutes or so. It's day 3.5 for me here in Tennessee, and I am just so thrilled to be here. I do want to just acknowledge the schools and districts that I've been able to visit over the first 2.5 days. Some incredible teaching, and incredible leadership in the principals and administrators. And so if this first 2.5 days is any indication, and I think the excellent kindergarten, middle school special ed, kindergarten, and 6th grade math teachers that we have in this state, I see why Tennessee has made such progress over the last decade, and I am just very, very excited to be a part of that. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We're going to move into the agenda now, but before we do, Sarah has an announcement to make.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just briefly, we had initially listed on the workshop agenda and on the meeting agenda for Friday an ESL policy revision. To solicit more input, though, both on the cut scores that are involved in that policy as well as to ensure that it's aligned across other rules and policies related to our English language learners, the department has requested that we pull that item from the workshop and the agenda, and so we're going to be moving that to our May meeting. So just note that that's a change in both the workshop agenda as well as tomorrow's meeting.
Thank you. I'm going to ask that all presenters please state your name and title for the record before you present. The first agenda item is updates from the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, Miss Erin O'Hara and Dr. Jason Grissom.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the board, it's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. My name is Erin O'Hara. I'm the Executive Director for the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, which I'm going to take a few minutes to explain to y'all before we have Dr. Grissom do a presentation about some research on school leadership and educator diversity. So the Tennessee Education Research Alliance is a partnership between Vanderbilt University's Peabody College of Education and the State Department of Education specifically. Our goal is to be a partnership that really works for practitioners. So the idea of the research practice type of partnership, which Tara is one of, is that really the practitioners, meaning in this case the State Department of Education, and the researchers actually design the research work together, do research in partnership together, meaning that as researchers like Dr. Grissom that we work with at Vanderbilt and in other institutions are doing work, we're frequently going back to the Department of Education to present things well before they become public. So here's something that we know about a particular subject. What do you all think that actually might mean? What other questions do you have? What feels important as the people who are working on these policies for you to know? So it's really the type of thing that is less just what our great research partners at Vanderbilt and other universities interested in, and well more, how are we thinking about helping the state improve over time? We do work on a statewide basis, so we are looking at issues across the state of Tennessee. And again, as I've said, we're focused on practice-oriented research. So we do focus mainly on policy. So when we talk about practice, we actually more mean policy and implementation at the state level than we do other things. So the research that we do is not necessarily focused at the school or classroom level as much as at the systems level, working with school districts, thinking about state policy and these types of things. I'll give you some examples in a minute. And then lastly, we have again, trying to make sure that we're really focused on what are the big issues for the state. Our primary partner is the State Department of Education. And Jason and I both work at Vanderbilt University. But we are trying to make sure that as we think about issues more broadly, we're looking at what are all of the things that various organizations within the state are interested in. So being a partnership with the state, we're focused actually as well on what are the things that you all might want to know to help you make policy. And Dr. Morrison serves on our advisory council, which also includes SCORE, the State Collaborative on Reforming Education, the Tennessee Organization of School Superintendents, the School Boards Association, TEA, the Educational Equity Coalition, and THEC. And so we use that council to really, two things. One, to again, try and inform, are we looking at the right things as we do research? And then also to present research before we make it public in order to get some feedback on sort of what are the things, again, we should be looking into more. So we're really focused on trying to do work that is useful for the state of Tennessee. I'm going to take just a couple more minutes to talk really quickly about what we do. So when we think about if we're going to be successful, what we really want to do is have rigorous, high quality, and timely research, meaning that we're doing things in a way that is both a really high level of quality, but we're also trying to do it as quickly as we can and give feedback as quickly as we can. We, again, are really looking to help you all influence policymakers, get things in front of you. So this is a great opportunity for us to do some of that, and we'd love to do more in the future. And then because of all of that, we want people to look at us and say, oh yeah, what they're doing is actually really helpful to what we're doing in Tennessee. So we also try and make the research something that, as I say frequently, my mom could understand a little bit better. People who are not necessarily experts in the field can understand sort of what we're saying. Our primary thing that we do is the annual educator survey in partnership with the State Department of Education. You all hopefully are familiar with the survey. All of the research work that we do involves educator feedback that we receive through the survey. We've devised that survey with all of the folks that I mentioned previously. Survey goes into the field March 6th this year. It is our 9th year. I believe that's right. You know when it's an 8th or a 9th and you're not sure which one the next one is? So we've been doing this since 2012. And then these are the 4 areas we primarily focus on. So early learning, state support for professional learning. So here we're thinking about things like instructional improvement, low-performing schools, and working on labor market issues. So just really quickly, a couple of things in these areas. So when we talk about early learning, we're primarily focused on the pre-K to 3 continuum there, a little bit of a heavier focus on literacy issues. One of our big studies here right now is looking at the instructional coherence that you might see from pre-K to K to first grade to second grade, an observational study of classrooms around the state to try and get a sense of one thing that might be explaining some issues with fade out from pre-K over time is the quality of the instruction through those early grades. We want to go and actually observe some of that. When we talk about professional learning here, again, we're really focused on instructional improvement. Primary thing, biggest sort of effort we're doing at this point is around feedback as part of the evaluation system. So trying to get a better sense from educators of what is the type of feedback that helps to improve their craft over time. Another thing, big focus there is actually looking at systems of professional learning. So we're doing some observations in a couple of school districts to try and get a sense of what are the systems around professional learning that can help improve teachers more. So when we see teachers improving more quickly, what are the things that are in place at the school district level, and how does that inform what the state could do? Low-performing schools, you've probably seen some work that we've done. Dr. Gary Henry and colleagues, Ron Zimmer, have done work around the Achievement School District and Innovation Zones. We continue to do that work over a course of, that's been about 6 years now. And we will also be doing some work looking specifically, again, at systems. So when we do see school districts, innovation zones, et cetera, that are doing a better job, what are the things that are available there that are actually driving more of that improvement? And Jason's going to talk a lot more about labor markets, so I'll let him cover that. So lastly, just to say, when we do this work, we're actually in partnership with the state. We're looking at the data that the state has over time. So we're looking at student achievement, we're looking at teachers. We're able to draw on a large set of information in partnership with the state to actually be able to look at how are the different initiatives that the state is working on, how are the questions that you all might have, that the department might have, actually affecting students and teachers over time. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Grissom.
So hi, I'm Jason Grissom. I'm an associate professor of public policy and education at Peabody College, Education and Human Development. Okay, I'll say that again. I'm Dr. Jason Grissom. I'm associate professor of public policy and education at the Peabody College of Education and Human Development at Vanderbilt University, and I'm also the faculty director of the Tennessee Education Research Alliance. All of that is in my email signature. It's long. So I have studied school leadership for over a decade, and a big part of what we do at Terra right now is focused on school leadership and the importance of school leadership for the state of Tennessee. Some other work that we've been doing recently is more in the area of educator diversity, thinking about racial and ethnic diversity of the workforce, educator workforce here in the state. So I'm going to talk a bit about each of those pieces, and I'm also going to, at the end, I'm going to connect them, actually talk about the connection between leadership diversity and teacher diversity. And so as I go, I hope you'll stop me as points of clarification, things that you want me to get into. So you'll see that some of the things I'm going to talk about at sort of the 25,000-foot level. Some things I'm going to get very much into the specifics about, and if there are things that I'm at the high level and you want me to talk in any more depth, I'm happy to do that. And I'm going to try to do it without standing and pointing, which is also a challenge for somebody who teaches in a college classroom. So to give you a sense of this will start with sort of the high-level stuff, and then we'll drill down a bit. So one of the big things that we've been learning a lot about at Terra through our work on school leadership is just about the importance of school leadership and how much school principals matter. And that's not really going to be a surprise to anybody in this room, but there's a lot of ways that we can use the data that we have to really document the ways in which school leaders matter for what's happening in their buildings. So some of the work that we've done, and I should mention that a lot of this work is summarized in policy briefs and working papers that are posted on the Terra website. But we've been able to link effective principles to higher test score growth over time, to lower turnover among educators, and especially lower turnover among the most effective teachers in those buildings. You'll see the little piece in the orange. One of the other interesting pieces that we've found is that effective school leaders also see higher turnover among ineffective teachers in their buildings. So that kind of higher turnover among ineffective teachers coupled with lower turnover among effective teachers, a phenomenon we refer to as strategic retention. Which is what you want to see, right? Not every educator that's in every building either has a good match with that building or maybe a match with that profession. And strong leaders, the data suggests that strong leaders are able to differentiate and implement strategies that can lead to differential retention of different kinds of teachers. Also more positive school climate as measured by the educator survey and several other outcomes. But one of the, I think, really interesting things that we've been able to do is that we're in looking at the practice rating. So the state has obviously an educator evaluation system. It applies to administrators the same way that it applies to teachers. 50% of the rating that's given to principals in the team system is from a practice rating, right, where supervisors are giving principals ratings pegged to the Tennessee Instructional Leadership Standards. And one of the things that we see in those ratings is that those practice ratings that principals receive through that evaluation system are actually able to tell us a fair bit about who's effective and who's not. And I think that's important for the state because there's a lot of criticism in education all the time about all the things that we're maybe not doing as well as we would like. This is an area where the state system seems there is predictive power in those ratings to look forward in a principal's career and see the outcomes that principal is able to get out of their building. So that's one piece just by way of saying school leaders are really important. I probably didn't need to convince you of that. But then we see some other patterns in the data that are not as much of a good story. And so one of those is that effective leaders aren't distributed equitably across schools in Tennessee. When we look at school characteristics, things like the fraction of kids that are free and reduced price lunch eligible, if we look at the achievement levels of kids in average in a particular school, and so forth. We see this inequitable distribution. And there's a bunch of different ways I could show you this. I'm gonna use a couple of different bar charts to illustrate this. These three different bars are showing you the fraction of principals in a given type of school that are in their very first year. So they've never been a principal before the current school year. And these schools are divided into low, medium, and high poverty schools on the basis of the fraction of the students in those schools that are free and reduced price lunch eligible. And what you can see is that in low poverty schools, so those that have 20% of kids that are receiving free and reduced price lunch or fewer, and those low poverty schools, only about a tenth of the principals in those schools in a given year in Tennessee are in their very first year. In contrast, if you look at high poverty schools, that number's 14%. So it's a 3 percentage point difference, but that's a 3 percentage point difference on a pretty small base, right? So it's about a third difference between the high poverty and low poverty schools. You can look at this other ways. So we could stretch this out. We could say, well, let's not just look at first year principals, let's look at first through third. So novice principals, people who are fairly early in their time as a principal. And you can see the pattern is very similar. About 30% of low poverty schools have a principal who is a novice compared to 40% of high poverty schools in the state. And I should mention, instead of using poverty, I could use achievement level. I could use the fraction of kids in that school that are students of color. You get very, very similar patterns. Another really important finding from this work, I think, is this isn't just an urban phenomenon. We tend to think a lot about Memphis-Shelby, we think a lot about MNPS and so forth, but this is a pattern that replicates across the different kinds of school districts that we have in the state. So this is the same kind of graphic, so that overall number is the one, the overall grouping is the one I just showed you, but you could also do this by dividing school districts into urban, suburban, and town or rural districts, and you can see that the pattern replicates. In each one of those three groupings, the low poverty schools are significantly less likely to have a first-year principal than the high poverty schools, and in fact, in rural districts in the state, rural high poverty schools in rural districts are the most likely to have a beginning principal of any of the kinds of districts that we're looking at here. An important implication, just a little bit of a sidebar, but the fact that so many of our principals in high poverty schools in rural areas are in their first year. And we could also look backwards and look at their work histories, and only about 2/3 of new rural principals have been an assistant principal. That's unusual relative to urban areas. They're a lot more likely to come directly out of teaching in rural areas, meaning they don't have they've not had school leadership experience, direct school leadership experience in rural areas. Now that's often because those schools don't have assistant principalships. The schools tend to be a lot smaller, and often those AP jobs are just not available. They're not there. But just to point that out. So you could also look not just at the first year in the principalship, you could look at the tenure in the school or how long they've been in the school. So here showing a similar graphic, but this time instead of time in the principalship, this is time in your school. So whether or not you're in your first year in that school, regardless of whether or not you've been a principal before or not, you can see the patterns are very similar, that low poverty schools are much less likely to have a new principal that year than a high poverty school is, and that pattern replicates regardless of whether or not you're looking at the urban districts, the suburban ones, or the rural ones.
Shockingly, I have the first question. Are our charter schools included in this?
Charter schools are not included here. They could be.
I know that a lot of charter school principals, at least in MNPS, are skew, and a lot of our charters here are high poverty, so they skew young. So I thought it might be that's doing something with the data.
It's a good question. There are. We could pull out charters. Maybe we could look at them separately, but I think they're not in these numbers. Okay. So then you could look. Well, you could say, well, all right, qualifications are one thing, measures of experience, but could we look at some measures of effectiveness? And the answer is we can. So, and I should say, one of the reasons you want to look at experience is because we know the year that a principal has the most difficulty, unsurprisingly, is their very first year, right? It's a really hard job. So figuring out how to do it well takes a little bit of time, and we see very consistently that beginning principals build in effectiveness over time. So we can look at their effectiveness ratings from team, for example. And so this is just that 50% that comes from the practice rating. So this is the supervisor of the principal going into that school and using the instructional leadership standards to say, okay, I'm looking at the practices that are happening in this building. How good are those practices, essentially? And what you can, and so this is, This time we're looking at the average score, and the average is set to 0. Okay, so they're centered at the average rating, which is about a 4 on the 5-point scale. And so then, but the important thing is the pattern. So what you can see is the low poverty schools, which are in the light green, are well above the average, all right? And the dark green are the high poverty schools, and they're well below the average. And in fact, the difference between the two is about a full rating point. So, you know, the average principal in a low poverty school is getting about a 4.5 on the rating scale. The average principal in a high poverty school is only getting about a 3.5. And again, you can see this replicates. It replicates across the urban districts, the suburban districts, and the town and rural districts that, you know, by the metric that we collect as a state to try to determine, at least in part, the quality of leadership practices in that particular building, the low poverty schools are very advantaged relative to the high poverty schools. All right, so the next question we have is, all right, so there's pretty clear patterns of sorting. Sorting on the basis of qualifications like experience, we could look at others, sorting on the basis of those effectiveness ratings. And the thing that we're interested in from a policy point of view is, well, what drives those patterns of sorting? And there are a couple of possibilities. So one of those is that when a vacancy arrives in a high poverty school, the district will tend to fill it differently than when a vacancy arrives in a low poverty school. Sure.
Looks like you're moving to a different area, so, and I wanted a question on the effectiveness.
Sure.
Have you correlated the effectiveness of the principal with how many years they would say were in the classroom before they became a principal, and how effective they were as a classroom teacher first?
We've done a little bit, this is some working analysis that we're doing now on the, to try to determine if you can look at the pre-service qualifications of principals to try to predict their level of effectiveness in their initial years in the job. And I guess I should say we're working on that now rather than give you some firm answers. The general patterns, though, I could say is most of the things that you can easily observe in the data about the work histories of those folks don't look like they're very predictive. You know, in general, there are some things that you can pull out. So, for example, it looks like people who were, if you were a high-quality assistant principal, it's not surprising that you're likely to be a high-quality principal as well. But most of the other things that that we can easily look at in the administrative data don't tell us very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So we could look at whether or not districts tend to place less qualified, less effective leaders in less advantaged schools. And the answer is they do. So when vacancies arise in high poverty schools, we're more likely to see that they are that those positions are filled with people who have less leadership experience and who scored lower in their first year. I showed you that already, but they in fact scored a little bit lower in their prior job. So because we can look at their work histories and we can go backwards and we can say, okay, a lot of people who are new principals are moving in from the assistant principal job. Well, those assistant principals were also rated using the rubric, and so we can look at the assistant principals that move into high poverty schools relative to low poverty schools. The ones that are moving into who are becoming new principals in high poverty schools, those assistant principals got lower ratings as an AP than the new principals that are coming into low poverty schools. I think I said that right. So the patterns are not really stark, but they're there, which suggests that there is something about placement. There's something about the way that those leaders are placed into high poverty versus low poverty schools. The other possibility is that leader turnover is very different. If leader turnover is much higher in a high poverty school than a low poverty school, then people are cycling through, then obviously their experience levels, if you're constantly replacing someone with a person who is less experienced, then that will create that experience differential. It also can create an effectiveness differential because people build effectiveness the longer that they're in the position. And we see really starkly that happens as well. So what I'm showing you in this graph are annual principal turnover rates by school. So again, overall, and then by urban, suburban, and rural districts. And so you can see that about 15% overall in low poverty schools, about 15% of principals a year are turning over. It's annual turnover rate of 15%. Now here I should say turnover means I'm in this building this year and next year I'm not in this building. I could be doing different things. I could move to another principal job in the same district. I could leave the system altogether. I could go to central office. But the point is that I'm not in the school in the leadership position that I was in last year. So the rates for low poverty schools are about 15%. For high poverty schools, you can see they're close to 20% on average. And again, that pattern tends to repeat for the urban districts, for the suburban districts, and again, most starkly for the rural districts. And in fact, principals in high poverty schools in rural districts turn over at the highest rates of any principals that we're looking at here in this analysis across the state.
Can I ask
Please
a
do.
question? How does Tennessee compare to other states relative to principal turnover? And this is total turnover, including voluntary?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. We can't very easily differentiate voluntary turnover from other kinds because the data don't tell us that. I mean, we can make some guesses because see, one thing that we see, for example, is that people who get very low team ratings, they're a lot more likely to leave. So, but Tennessee doesn't look so different. So nationally, we can compare. There are some data sources that allow you to say something about principal turnover on a national level. Our average rates in Tennessee are pretty similar to what the average rates are nationally, and a look at national data tells you essentially will tell you the same story. While I'm mentioning leader turnover, so leader turnover helps contribute to this inequitable distribution of leadership across different kinds of schools, but leader turnover is also not great on its own. So another analysis that we've done has linked the turnover of school leaders to other kinds of outcomes in the schools, and that analysis shows that achievement dips in both math and reading for 2 years, so that it takes 2 years to recover from the move of a principal out of his or her school. And we see other things that happen as well, like teacher turnover spikes in the years that the principal leaves. So to give you some sense of the mechanism, I could talk more about this. Not every kind of a principal move is a bad one, but on average, principal turnover appears to have negative impacts on the schools that it happens in, suggesting there's lots of reasons to try to promote a more stable leadership workforce in the state. Okay, so I'm going to move on from that unless there are other questions about the leadership piece.
I do have
Please do.
questions. I'm sitting here thinking that what you're sharing is not altogether shocking news. The challenge is when you have the data, what do you do with it? There are so many factors that go into what causes turnover, whether it's for teachers or it's for principals. I'm just sitting here wondering, as a state, and based on your research, what do we do with this information? What would you be recommending to the education, to the Department of Education, to the State Board, that we do with this information? Because I'm wondering how much of this is shared with districts. I'm looking at Dale Lynch in the room from TOS, Executive Director, because they would sit in front of us, I'm sure, and tell us of all the reasons why they do what they do. And you cannot force, I mean, I think you could force a principal to go into a particular school. I think you might lose that person sooner than later if you did, if they didn't want to go into that particular school, because there's all these challenges, and I'm going to go on and on and on, but I'm going to stop. So tell me what you think about that.
So first thing I'll say is that Dale Lynch had me over to present this work at TOS earlier this week. So the superintendents across the state saw this earlier this week. I mean, this is obviously a tough problem, right? So I think there are different pieces. So I think, first of all, school leadership is a really, really hard job. It's one of the hardest jobs in education. The level of complexity is really, really high. I think one of the ways that you get good people into one of the ways that you get good people in is to think about pre-service support clearly, but also think about keeping them through really strong in-service support. I think there's a lot of variation around the state in the degree to which we are supporting principals, especially principals who are in very challenging school environments. And so investment in service support for principals who are in some really tough jobs, I think, is really important. And there's, I think, some levers to be pulled there potentially. I think the other hard part is a little bit the hearts and minds piece, which it's harder to think about what the policy lever is for, but it would be really nice to see a different narrative around the placement of school leaders across the state. I think often the reward for doing a good job in a challenging school is to get to move to another school where the job is perceived to be a better job, right? And maybe comes with fewer challenges. And I think that's unfortunate. It'd be really nice if we could think of being a great leader in a very challenged school environment as being the capstone of a leadership career. Now, I don't know how we get to that, but it would be really nice to have the mind shift, I think, in the state to think about that.
A couple of things that, as we've presented this work to school leaders or in groups of folks who are thinking about this deeply. So one, and what Jason just mentioned about attracting and keeping high quality principals, one of the things we do know from the data is that actually pay is not all that different across schools. Now, we don't know whether or not, if it was, that might result in differences in terms of retention for principals. But we do know that, I'm looking at Jason to make sure that I'm saying things. He's nodding, so that's good. That in fact it's not different. We don't know much about what would happen if it were.
Within districts.
Within districts. Another thing that the department, working with the governor last year, is working on a couple of different things that we're now looking at from the perspective of professional learning for either incoming principals or sitting principals. So there's a rural principals network that has seen this kind of work a couple of times and some other things that Jason's doing, but we want to know more about what are the factors happening within that network. Is that the kind of professional learning that is very helpful for those folks when they come out of that work? The Tennessee Transformational Leadership Alliance has 9 programs across the state. We're actually doing a study right now on what are the factors that are at play within those programs. Is there anything we can know about how that then impacts how principals perform over time? But we do have this sense that actually the in-service supports, which we don't know that much about, and we're hoping to learn more about, are a big part of it.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Tucker.
Thank you. I think the first slide, you talked about like the benefits of a high quality leader, and you mentioned that none of them would be shocking, and none of them were to me, but you mentioned school climate. So I'm curious, is that from the teacher perspective? Was that based on teacher evaluations? And and I don't know where this data would come from, but I'm just curious, has there been any data looked at related to quality of the principal and family engagement, and how that correlates? Because I mean, just anecdotally, I think a high-quality principal increases family engagement at the school. But
yeah, it's a really good question. So our analysis of school climate comes from the Teacher Educator Survey, because we get really good measures of school climate from teachers in buildings. We don't systematically collect information from parents. Some districts do, but we don't as a state. So it's really hard. From where we sit, we don't have the data to be able to say. I think in studies that have been done in other areas have suggested that school leadership is really important for parental and community engagement in schools, but we don't have a way to know that here in Tennessee.
Just an opportunity to take, which I'm going to do every chance I can, and would hope all of you would as well. That, what Jason just said, is why the Educator Survey is so important. So again, goes out March 6th. We'll be in the field for 6 weeks. We had 58% of educators answer the survey last year. We'd love to see that number continue to go up. It really does inform our work, also directly informs the department.
It does. Cannot say how many meetings I've sat in with people at TDOE where we are reading the qualitative responses that teachers have put in that survey. I mean, it's the degree that it's probably a hidden gem in this state. So
Yes, Mr. Kraus.
You've got us interested now. This is good. Questions in workshop are good.
Yeah.
What would you tell the deans of education in our state that are cranking these principals out of these MED programs for administrative endorsement?
I don't know what I would tell them. I'm not sure we're doing a great job at thinking about the bridge from administrator principal preparation programs into the principalship. I mean, I think this is a place we could really be thinking about. There's bridge support, induction, the link between what happens when you're in that program and you've learned all this great stuff, presumably, and then how that translates into your first job. One of the challenges that we see, by the way, is that the typical person leaves their administrative preparation program. I want to say it's 4 to 5 years before we see them seated as an executive principal in a building. So there's a time gap there that it can be challenging. Now, a lot of those people are going to assistant principal jobs in that interim space, but I think often we think, well, the person graduates and then they immediately go in and they become a principal, and that's not actually what happens. And so I think it then becomes challenging for the preparation program really to link with the districts that they're working with. And but there have to be ways that we can do that better. I'm not sure I have a much better answer than that. It's not something I've thought about a ton, but
I think your answer is great, though. And I think we're at a good inflection point for this. Now that the MED programs in Tennessee are no longer just seen as a way to get a pay raise, which is exactly what they used to be, I think it gives us a chance to really have hard conversations with the colleges of education, which we are in the midst of those same conversations around their initial service programs. But this feels like the perfect intonation point. And I hope as a board we think about how to do that, because all of our colleges, in their defense, they're in the transition right now. Most of their enrollments have completely plummeted because people aren't getting paid more for these MEDs and EDSs. But at the same time, you have really good and thoughtful faculty that want to deliver instruction that makes a better school leader. I think we're at a juncture here where we could maybe lead a conversation with those deans to say, here's what we're learning. How do we employ that? How do we think differently about why you enter an MED program, which, again, the state has disrupted in a really productive way due to the move from extra pay. So I would commend that to the board for us to start thinking hard about the role higher ed should be playing.
Thank you. Yes.
Just to piggyback on Mike's comments, because I think that's exactly right. We are at a place as a state where we can really look at leader prep and have some important conversations about what strong principal prep looks like. To the extent part of your research is helping us understand those pre-service practices that are better aligning with effectiveness after graduation. I know there are a number of challenges that come from that time gap that you mentioned, Jason, around when someone graduates and when they go into lead as a principal, but ideally we're taking advantage of that time to build on the supports and the effective practices that were begun as part of their training program. But I know things like, we've looked at a performance-based assessment as part of teacher prep. Similarly, are there best practices like that begin to emerge that we should think about as a board for leader prep, other qualities of sort of that strong pipeline?
Yeah. I mean, you and I have talked a lot about the challenges of trying to use the outcomes data to link backwards. But we've started having conversations with folks at the department about getting better information about about the input side, what's happening in programs. There's a lot that could be collected there, probably to be done in a little bit different of a way. But I think it's a manageable number of programs, which is nice. If we could learn more about what those programs are doing and what are the practices that programs are implementing that are associated with, future effectiveness, better placement practices, et cetera. I think it's a big, wide open area for researchers to help shed some light on. Other questions about this before I'm going to transition a little bit?
Let me just ask
Sure thing.
one other question. When you look at turnover, have you drilled down into the top reasons for turnover? And I just have to believe burnout probably plays a significant factor, and if anything's been focused on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things, so we can, through the educator survey, again, we can look at what administrators report over time. We ask them about their experiences as a leader as well, and we can use that information to predict who's going to stay or go in their buildings. And you're right. So principals who report things like lower job satisfaction, more challenging environments, leadership challenges in their building and so forth, those people are less likely to stick around. So that definitely seems to be part of the story. Going back to what I said earlier, some of these jobs are really, really tough jobs. And I think when principals don't feel supported to help meet the challenges of these tough environments, it can be a tough ask. All right. Whoops. We jump forward here. All right, there we go. So the next thing I wanted to share with you is a little bit of our work. A lot of this work is going to be very descriptive about the turnover patterns of teachers of color across the state of Tennessee, which has obviously been a hotter topic in the last year to 18 months. Thinking about what are the challenges in that area for the state. And I just want to show you a little bit, some of this I'm sure you've seen before, but just to give you a little bit of sense from the data about what we see, the composition of the workforce and what its turnover looks like. And I think there's a little bit of a narrative here that may be surprising. So these are what these lines, these two flat lines, and the flatness is part of the point. This is looking over time at the percentage of teachers in Tennessee who are white, which is that dotted line at the top, and teachers who are black, which is the unbroken line closer to the bottom. You can see there's also a dotted line for other race and ethnicity that's at the very bottom. We have very few teachers in Tennessee who are not either white or black. And we have some data challenges also, I should say, in trying to capture race and ethnicity for teachers who aren't white or black. But the numbers are very, very small regardless. So we have a teacher workforce that's about 86% white, an educator workforce is about 86% white, and it has been for as long as our data go back. The personnel data go back to the 2002-2003 school year. And so just for context, about 35% of Tennessee students are students of color, and 24% of those students are black. So and those numbers are changing a little bit over time. So as you can imagine, we have a student, the composition of students in Tennessee are changing relatively quickly. The composition of the educator workforce is not changing very much at all. And so part of what we wanted to do from a research perspective is try to understand a little bit about that phenomenon. And so what I want to talk a little bit about is teacher turnover by race. So I want to focus specifically on teachers here rather than leaders. And this is just mapping teacher turnover rates over time. So again, turnover in this case means I'm a teacher in my building this year, and next year I'm not a teacher in that same building, okay? And the solid line here in the middle is just the average teacher. And then the other two lines, we have black teachers at the top, and the dotted line at the bottom are white teachers. And what you can see is that in every year, black teachers' turnover is quite a bit higher than white teachers' turnover. And you might also wonder why it's spiking up and down so much. It's because the numbers are so much smaller. So when you get this low denominator, it's much easier for numbers to bounce around a bit. Sure.
I agree. That's a very important point. But something else I see on that chart that disturbs me as much is it looks like the entire turnover rate, whether white, black, or whatever,
It's trending up.
is trending up.
That's right.
And that's, I think, one of the challenges we have is to get good teachers qualified to stay in the classroom.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
I think you just seen that right there.
Yeah, that's right. So you do see that the one dip there at the very end, but in general, the trend over time from 2003 to the present is upsloping. That's right. And I'm going to break this down a little bit for you so you can see in a little more specificity. You see the patterns are a little bit different when we look at different kinds of turnover. So now I'm going to, instead of defining turnover as just the binary, I'm here or not, this is looking at pathways out of my school. So the upper left quadrant is teachers that exit the system. In other words, they disappear from the Tennessee data. They either moved to Kentucky, or they decided to go work, in nursing or something. Okay, we don't see them anymore. And the good news here is that the lines aren't trending up to quite the same degree. Okay, so we're not doing we're doing at least we're not sort of getting worse on our ability to keep teachers in the system. And I will point out there's one spike in 2009 that is completely driven by Memphis, and the solid line here are black teachers. And so you can see in terms of propensity to exit the system, black teachers and white teachers, except in that 1 year, look very similar. And in fact, in the last 3 years, the most recent 3 years that we have data for, black teachers have actually been staying in the system at higher rates than white teachers. And you can see it. We can also break it down into within district moves, so moving to another school within your same district, across district moves, which are not very common in Tennessee, and position changes, which are teachers who become an assistant principal, for example. And you can see in these lower ones, the across district moves and the position changes, black teachers and white teachers look very, very similar. The big difference is in the upper right quadrant, which is the within district moves. Where black teachers are just astoundingly more likely to change schools than white teachers are. And so the big message here is exits look are very similar between black and white teachers, but within district moves are really what are driving the turnover difference. And the reason I want to point that out is because the national narrative, the national research suggests that black teachers are leaving the classroom at much higher rates than white teachers are, but that just doesn't seem to be the case in Tennessee. In Tennessee, black teachers and white teachers are staying in the system at roughly the same rate, which I think is an important thing to know because it's good news that we're not losing black teachers, and it suggests that attempts to diversify the workforce, the educator workforce, will gain. It suggests to me that focusing on recruitment is at least as important as thinking about the retention question.
So with that distinction with black teachers, were you able to, try and understand, are they being assigned to high poverty schools and that have some effect on that data?
Yeah, if you'll put a pin in that 1 second, that's actually where I'm going. That's that's a couple slides. But yes, that you're anticipating part of what the story is going to be. Yep. Other questions? All right. So, okay, so this is the question we wanted to ask is, all right, so, you know, we're not seeing huge exits, but we're seeing really big differences in turnover. And we care about turnover on its own because even if those teachers are staying in those schools, as you can imagine, black teachers in the state are working with very different kinds of kids, okay? That's what I'm going to show you in just a second. But black teachers are working with marginalized student populations at much higher rates. They're more likely to work with students of color, though, much more likely to work with kids who are low income, et cetera. And because we know teacher turnover is bad for kids, okay, teacher stability is really, really important. Even if they're not exiting the system, you still want to understand where turnover is coming from and what can we do to think about how we can make making the educator workforce in those schools in particular more stable. And so we asked this question, well, what could be driving these turnover differences? And so one possibility is that there are differences in other teacher characteristics. So suppose, for example, that black teachers were just a lot older on average than white teachers, and we know older teachers are leaving at higher rates, but are moving at higher rates maybe because they're getting closer to retirement. So that would be a possibility you would want to entertain. Another possibility, as you just suggested, is there are differences in school context. So there could be differences in student populations. There could be difference in colleagues. There could be differences in leadership, climate, et cetera, et cetera. And so if black teachers and white teachers are working in different kinds of schools, that might be driving some of those turnover differences. And there could be other kinds of differences. I mean, there could be differences in evaluation. There could be differences in lots of other things. Okay, we haven't dug into all of this in the level of specificity yet that we want to, but just to give you some sense of what some of the drivers that we can point out are. All right, so. One of the things that we see that's important is that this first one that I pointed out doesn't look so important. So black and white teachers, in fact, look very similar in terms of their other demographic characteristics, age, experience, and so forth. There's a little bit of a gap in the number of years they've been in their given school, but that's just tautological with the fact that turnover rates are different. Black teachers, in fact, are more educated than white teachers on average in the sense that they're more likely to have a master's degree, 67% to 56%. But the point here is, in fact, black and white teachers on other measures don't look that different. And because they don't look that different, these kinds of characteristics can't really be much of an explanation for those turnover differences. And we find, in fact, they aren't. It accounts for almost none. These characteristics count for almost none of the turnover gap between black and white teachers. But, and this is where you were going, the big difference is the types of schools that black teachers versus white teachers in the state work in. So I'll point to the next to last row in particular. Unsurprisingly, black teachers are a lot more likely to work in urban schools in the state than, and 75% of them, in fact, are in urban schools compared to only 26% of white teachers. Okay, so the urban districts in the state have different kinds of student populations, and so therefore, black teachers are tending to work with different student populations than white teachers are. So 78% of the average, 78% of the students in the typical school that a black teacher works with in Tennessee, 78% of those kids are black or Hispanic compared to only 27% for white teachers. 79% of those kids are free and reduced price lunch eligible compared to only 57% of the kids in the typical white teacher's school. This achievement index measure is a measure we created. It's basically an average of test scores, but put on a scale where 0 is the mean. And so it's a big mean difference, essentially, is the takeaway that black teachers are teaching students who are scoring much lower on state standardized tests on average than the kids that white teachers are teaching. And then one other thing, because I'm going to come back to this in just a second. Black teachers are also teaching in schools where they have very different kinds of peers. So the typical black teacher is teaching in a school where 46% of the other teachers in that building are black, compared to white teachers are only teaching in buildings where 8% of their colleagues are black. And that's just by way of saying that the teaching workforce is very segregated across the state in terms of the kinds of schools that they work in. Okay, so then we can sort of start to put some of these pieces together and see, well, how much of these other school contextual factors might be explaining these turnover differences between black and white teachers. So this is a graphic that's from a policy brief that just came out from Tara, where we dug into this in a good amount of depth. But these two lines are the turnover rates for black teachers and white teachers. But conditional on a lot of other factors, so using statistical controls to account for a lot of other characteristics of the school environment. This is looking over the percentage of black students that are in those schools. And so at the very bottom, the 0 to 10%, so those are schools that have very, very few black students. And you can see that in those schools, black teachers are slightly higher than white teachers to turnover. But as the number of black students in the school goes up, you can see that the lines flip. And so, in fact, black teachers are a lot more likely to stick in schools with many black students than white teachers are. It's not sort of linear over the distribution of black students. But for the majority of schools in the state, which are actually the group from 10 to about 50 or 60, their turnover rates are essentially indistinguishable. But they're very different. They're very different in the tails. But black teachers are more likely than white teachers to stay in schools that have very high fractions of kids of color. This is a graphic that's meant to illustrate the fact that teachers' colleagues also matter. So this line, we thought long and hard about how to show this, and I'm not sure we came out with the way that is the most intuitive. But basically, this is just one line that is trying to illustrate what the estimated difference in turnover between black and white teachers are. And so, this time the x-axis is the percentage of black teachers in a school rather than students. The point here is that when essentially the main point is really that black teachers' turnover rates are falling in the fraction of black colleagues that they are surrounded by. In schools where black teachers are very isolated, they're much more likely to turn over. Where they're racially isolated in terms of looking at the colleagues that they work with. Once you get to a point of about 15 or 20% of black teachers in a school, you reach this kind of critical mass where black teachers become much more likely to stick. And so this is just by way of saying that it's more than just the characteristics of the students that are in the buildings. It also has to do with the characteristics of the educators. It has to do with the climate in the building. It has to do with the leadership, which I'm going to show you in a moment. There's a lot of complexity that goes into explaining these turnover differences, but that also means there are lots of different attack points because there are lots of different levers that could be pulled potentially to help think about those differences. Oh, and so this is sort of the last piece, is that I could throw a bunch of stuff in what we call a regression equation to think about. If I essentially statistically account for all of these different factors at once, can I close this black-white turnover gap to 0? And if I can, that means I've measured all of the factors that are relevant to determining whether or not a black teacher versus a white teacher in the state is going to turn over. And the answer is I can't. So I can explain a big portion of it, but I can't explain it all. There's a lot that remains unexplained, things that we don't have the data to be able to really dig in necessarily to what's going on. This is something we think about in the design of the teacher-educator survey. People generate other hypotheses. Well, you should be looking at this thing, and then we have the opportunity each year to try to ferret this out. But this is a topic that is of interest to, I think, lots of different folks around the state, not just us that are working on it. And Aaron, you might want to mention the focus groups and so forth. But this, trying to get a more holistic picture of what's going on here, I think is important because there are clearly some relevant differences here, and our data are able to say something about those differences, but not be able to tell the whole story.
So one of the things that Jason just mentioned, there's a group called the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance. And as we've presented this information to both our advisory council and members of that advisory council that include the Tennessee Educational Equity Coalition, that group, the Educators of Color Alliance and others, said, this is great, but this only tells you, all we're looking at here is a series of numbers. We don't know anything about sort of why teachers are reacting. And so the Tennessee Educators of Color Alliance went out and actually spoke with a number of their members and other teachers of color to get more information about sort of what are the things that are driving teacher turnover, drive teacher satisfaction, and some of the things you see in that report are around these same types of ideas. So isolation is an issue, feeling as though you as a teacher of color in the building are responsible for all of the students of color in the building if you're not sort of in a building that has more students of color in it. And they suggest some policy implications as well in that report. So if you haven't seen it, and we're happy to follow up with both these reports of ours and that report, I think it's useful as you think about this issue.
Okay, and so I told you at the end I'd come back and link the educator diversity piece to the leadership piece. So that's these last few slides. And so this last sort of takeaway message that we've pulled out of our data is that leadership diversity really matters. And in part, if you care about teacher diversity, then leadership diversity ends up being an important part of the story. So to ask this question of whether or not the race of a school's principal affects the composition of a school's teaching staff. And you could think about why that might matter for two different reasons. So it's possible that principals of color relative to white principals hire differently. It's also possible that they retain differently, that they focus their retention efforts differently across teachers that are in their school. And so if we track those schools over time, the question we want to ask is, well, do we see differences in hiring or turnover behavior? Particularly the hiring and turnover of teachers of color, when we see that the race of the principal in the state changes in the school. And the answer is yes and yes and yes. Okay, so this is just to show you that black and white principals hire differently. Okay, so what is this graphic showing you? So what this graphic is showing you is at the vertical line, that's a principal switch. So that's on average across the state, and this is looking over time on the x-axis. So we've drawn a vertical line here at the year of a principal switch, and then we're showing you what's going on in that school 1 year before, 2 years before, and 3 years before, and then we're showing you what's going on in that school 1 year after the switch, 2 years after the switch, and 3 years after the switch. And then the different lines are showing you different kinds of switches of the principal. So the triangle line at the top is a black principal was in that school and then switches, and a black principal follows in that school. And I should mention on the y-axis is the proportion of new hires coming into that building in that year who are black, teachers who are black. And what you can see is that the line at the top is flat. Schools that have black principals are hiring black teachers at very high rates, but switching from a black principal to another black principal, that doesn't change the pattern. At the bottom are in the line with the dots. Those are white principals before, and now there's a principal switch, and it's a different principal, but it's a white principal again. And you can see the line again is flat. There's not a change. The interesting lines are the two in the middle, which are the diamond line and the line with the squares. So the diamond line is, on average, schools that had a white principal, and then there was a switch, and after that white principal was replaced by a black principal. And the square line is there was a black principal, and then that principal was replaced by a white principal. And what you see is that the lines diverge, right? So those two different principals of two different racial backgrounds are hiring differently. So the white principal was replaced by the black principal, and that the hiring of black teachers went up. On the square line, the white principal was replaced by, a black principal was replaced by a white principal, and the hiring of black teachers went down. And you might say, well, why does that happen? And we dug in a lot about what, where this difference is coming from. And one of the really interesting things is because we have really extensive work history data on all of these folks, we can look backwards and we can see that principals of both white and black principals are more likely to hire people they've worked with in the past, people that maybe they were teachers with in a previous job. So going back to that, the fact that teachers are segregated that I mentioned before, new black principals are more likely to hire from the kind of this network pool that they have, and that tends to be a network that has more black teachers in it. And similarly for white principals and their hiring. And so the top line result then is that having a black principal increases the probability that a newly hired teacher is black by almost 8 percentage points. Now, I will say we also have data from the state of Missouri. None of us care about the state of Missouri necessarily, but we can do the same analysis in Missouri, get the exact same number. It's also 7.5%. It's within 1/10 of a percentage point. So that's just to say there's nothing I don't think particular about Tennessee here, but the patterns are pretty stark when you look at hiring. People just hire differently, in part because they're drawing on their networks differently. We can also see that they retain differently. So we can look at teachers and how they turn over. We can even look within teachers statistically over time. And teachers are more likely to stick with principals with whom they share a racial background. So having a principal of the same race decreases the likelihood that a teacher turns over by about 30%, 3 percentage points, which is big because the average teacher is only turning over 14% of the time in a given year. We can look at their educator survey data as well. We also see that Black teachers who have Black principals report things like higher job satisfaction, higher feelings of support. So it's not just showing up in the administrative data. There seems to be something qualitatively that's different about those teachers' experience in those schools. And so since you get this difference in hiring and you get this difference in retention, that just means by construction you get this difference in the composition. And so again, I'll focus you on these middle lines where you get this switch of principals of different types. But this time the y-axis is the proportion of Black teachers in a school, and the switch to a Black principal just increases the overall fraction of Black teachers that are in that school. Now, we care about that for lots of reasons, but one of the reasons that we care about that is that there's just this accumulating body of evidence in Tennessee and elsewhere that that having teachers of color in buildings is really important for all kids, but especially important for kids of color, since those teachers are more likely to be working in buildings that have higher numbers of kids of color. This turns out to be a benefit to the kids in those buildings. That's some analysis that we're working on right now. I can come back and talk to you about that in the future. But this really seems to matter. It really seems to have purchase for outcomes in those buildings. And you can link it directly back to these characteristics of leadership.
Is there any data regarding the decision to switch a Black principal to a white principal and the opposite, white to Black? The decisions that were made in those cases? Do you have any evidence on that?
We don't. So, I mean, this is one of the things that we, in our longer term plan, that we want to learn more about. Not even just the racial dimension. I think we're very interested in general in thinking about what the placement processes for principals are, how districts think about selection and placement. I think that's something I think nobody knows very much about. That's, again, not a Tennessee specific question. I think that's a question for the field. But that's one of our medium term goals, is to learn a bit more about how we're thinking about that locally, because I think that's really important.
And I think you made this point before, Madam Chair, but a lot of times when you come and you present this type of research to folks, in a lot of ways what we're confirming is things that you might have already thought were the case, right? So we're able to look at the data. You have questions about why is a certain pattern happening? What do we see when we implement a new policy? And what we're able to do is come back and say to you, yes, in fact, what you thought might be happening is happening, or no, here are some subtle differences in what we see. What we do is not then to take it and do the type of work that y'all do, which is to turn that into policy implications. But all of the folks that we work with on our advisory council are those types of folks. And so should there be things that you're interested in knowing, Sarah can come to us and say, hey, these 4 things from the State Board of Education feel like priorities, and we're happy to do that.
I think it also speaks to the diversity recruitment process at our EPPs. I know that we've been focused on that, and I think it is how many are out there that are actually ready to step into those positions. And I know that a lot of districts are searching across the nation to find principals to replace those that are retiring. And so I think the candidate pool is low, and I think that the attraction of those from diverse backgrounds is also a huge challenge. So I think that's part of our equation.
Just to jump in, I was hoping I'd have the opportunity to say this, but you can see why I enjoy the advisory council meetings with Tara. The data is fascinating. The way they're able to use it to help inform our policy work, I think, is really increasingly relevant and productive. I'd love for you to come back if the board is willing to talk more about the research on sort of why it matters to have those teachers of color for students of color. I think it's really compelling, and I think it does have implications for our work, particularly on the teacher prep side. We've gotten some pushback from programs who've said, why does it matter that we have to look at diversity of our candidates, for example, especially in some of our rural areas? But I think the research increasingly is very compelling as to why it matters. So I think those are the kind of things that will help us continue to both stay the course in some places and adjust course as we think about, what matters for teacher prep, what matters for leaders, and the policy sort of implications.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. I love talking about this stuff. I mean, it's not my job to think directly about the policies, but I think there's a lot that we have great information in this state, and we have people who want to learn about what are the patterns, what are the things that we can learn from all this great information that we have spent all of this money and time and investment in trying to collect. So I'm more than happy to do that.
Yes, Bob.
Yeah, that's a question I had is you're seeing a lot of data. How much time, how long have you been working on this?
So the partnership between Vanderbilt and the State Department of Education and the state more broadly goes back to the Race to the Top era, so it was born out of that. We essentially reconfigured a little bit, relaunched in 2016. So the work's been underway for the last 6 or 8 years, depending on how you look at it. But really, in this form that we've been doing it in this way is really more the last 2.5 years or so.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Excellent. Thank you both so much.
Thank you all so much for having us.
Great work. Thank you. Our next agenda item is master plan mid-year progress. Or did we switch? We switched? I think I don't have the revised version of the agenda. Okay. Individualized education accounts.
Okay, and I'm going to move where I can see all of you, but this will be brief. I wanted to make sure you have these materials as part of your workshop materials that were provided to you earlier this week, both the overview of the IEA, which is the Individual Education Accounts Program in Tennessee, as well as the 17-18 full report. Rebecca Wright, I think, who's with us in the back, is the program director at the Department of Education, and she and I talked earlier this week. I wanted to make sure to present some of this information briefly to you, but she really is the expert on this program and is available for questions, and I'm sure will correct me if I misspeak as well. So just first context in terms of this program, it was signed into law back in January 2015 initially. The first students to participate were in January of 2017, sort of at a mid-year point, and the current school year is the second full year of its implementation. The program itself is really designed to be a school choice program for eligible students with certain disabilities, and the idea is to allow those students and families to choose education options that meet their individual needs using the state and local dollars as part of the BEP. Our role as a board is to promulgate the rules associated with this program, and it's the Department of Education in conjunction with the Department of Health who have also been consulted as part of the rollout of this program. Currently, in terms of the administration of the program, that is housed within the Department of Education. And as I mentioned, Rebecca Wright, who's with us, is the program director there. So just a couple things to highlight in both the overview document and that, again, are gone into more detail in the full report. But we currently have, for the 18-19 school year, 137 students participating in the IEA program. That's up from last year. Last year we had 87 students, so the increase this year is somewhat significant. And when you look at the students that are participating this year, it's about an 80% retention rate from those that were participating last year. The students are in roughly 40 districts across the state. As you would imagine, the majority are in our major urban districts, Davidson, Shelby, Knox, and Hamilton. In terms of students with disabilities and who's participating, over half of those 137 students list autism as their primary or secondary disability. And the second most common is intellectual disability. Those are the two that you see most common across those students. There are actually 15 non-public schools who've been approved as part of this program and are participating, but in talking with Rebecca, most of the students, or at least many, over half we believe, are being homeschooled either through a homeschool network or by the individual family. And then finally, just something to point out, because again, it is the state and local portion of the BEP that follows these students as part of the IEA program, and that varies from district to district based on the local contribution. On average, the award is $6,900 across the state when you look, again, at the average award. So I'll stop there. Again, I'm probably not the best one to answer questions, but if you have any questions, I may invite Rebecca up, or you can catch her at the break. But anything initially?
Ms. Tucker.
Sorry, you'll get used to this. Mine are probably for Rebecca. I don't know, but I can ask you, Sarah, and see. I have a couple obvious.
Why don't you come join me, Rebecca?
As the parent of a kid with a disability, you know, I always have a lot of questions for you when this happens. One of the questions I had was, and Sarah touched on the fact, and I looked at it, that it's kids with autism and kids with ID, pretty significantly higher percentages in the program, yet those are the disabilities where the services that those kids receive are usually the most expensive, honestly. And so I'm trying to figure out if you guys have any data or any indication, even if it's just anecdotal, on that disconnect, why there are so many of those families coming out of the public school system and opting for the IEA when their services are so much more expensive than what this can cover.
So it's a great question. Unfortunately, yeah,
There you go.
I just need to speak into it more, use my teacher voice. So we don't have data on the reason why students with certain types of disabilities would be enrolling in the program at higher rates. We have added some questions about why a parent enrolled their child in the program at the beginning. So that's something we're trying to get some data on for right now. We do have some data about how much parents are spending above and beyond the amount of the IEA award. And so that gives us some indication about how much, like, I think it's about 60% of families have enough with the IEA to cover all of their educational expenses. But what that doesn't tell us is how many families are opting not to enroll their child in the program because of the differences in the costs.
And that actually leads me to my next question. I don't have that many, Madam Chair, but the funds spent, funds not spent in the report, I mean, and I know it's an average, but that's actual data from the families, right? That's not the money that was in the budget and then not spent. It looks like almost half of average families are only spending about half of the money, which is, to me, I mean, when you think about, so then that's going to lead me to my third question. When you think about the needs of kids with disabilities and the requirements of IEA that they do, at least some of the basic educational stuff, and I should probably know this from the grilling that I did on the front end, but is there oversight on our part, on the department's part, to make sure that the kids are getting an appropriate education, even though I know parents, I get the parental rights tension, but I mean, I'm worried that you have kids who've been pulled out of public school, they're not spending a whole lot of money, and they have disabilities. Like, are those kids getting what they need?
So I can definitely understand that concern. In terms of what the IEA law gives the department authority to do, we have them take annual assessments in grades 3 through 8. But as far as what scores they make on that, as those assessments, there's not any provision in the law that says that they have to make certain scores. There are provisions in the state homeschool law that require students to make certain progress in certain grade levels based on assessments. And then there's also private school monitoring. So those are things done outside of the IEA program, but they are being done. They're just not through our team.
Okay. And then I think my last question, so I am well aware of how much work you've put into outreach. And we've had a lot of conversations about that and making sure, and I actually get the little postcard in the mail letting me know that I can sign up. So I know that's happening, and I appreciate that. I want to thank you. What confuses me, though, is that you guys have done a lot of that, and yet 15 of 76 families completed the survey.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if you have any ideas, I mean, other than pulling your hair out, what you can do to get more responsiveness from the families, because obviously that's where you're going to get, we talked a little, you were here for that last thing about data, like this is an opportunity for family data if you can get it. And I'm just wondering if you guys have any ideas of what else you can do, because I know you've done a lot.
Yeah, we've definitely been exploring that. We'd love more survey participation. We've looked at maybe providing some sort of incentive, but that's difficult when it comes to what kind of incentives we can provide. So that's the challenge there. We also know that just families are busy, especially families of students with disabilities. This may not be on the top of their list for things to provide feedback. So it's a low number, but we're happy that it's about 20% last year, which we're hoping goes up this year. And I will say that number doesn't reflect multiple students. So a lot of our families have multiple kids in the program. So it's actually a little bit higher than 20% in terms of actual parents.
Okay, thank you. And again, I want to thank you for all that you've done you were given this and have been you've worked really hard to roll it out, and I appreciate that.
Mr. Eby.
Thank you. So 137 people participated across the state, students across the state.
Yes.
Out of how many potential eligible?
Approximately 42,000 students.
Okay, so why do you think it's such a small percentage?
We don't have data on that. We don't survey families who don't apply for the program, so I'm as curious as you as to why. Anecdotally, we've heard that some of the things parents are concerned about are waiving their child's rights through IDEA. That's a very big decision to make. It could also be the school options in their area. Are there public schools, serving their child? Are the private and home schools in their area also able to serve their child? It really depends on the school options and what their child's individual needs are. And then cost and the amount of the award can also be a factor.
I would encourage you to get as much data as you can on that, because I've heard that as being a criticism of the program, is that it's only reaching 137 out of 40,000, so.
Great point. Mr. Cobbins.
So this was our first full year?
Second.
Second,
Yes.
second, okay. So are there any modifications that you would recommend relative to eligibility requirements? And that may touch on some of what Mr. Eby may be suggesting.
So that would be above my pay grade in terms of eligibility. That would be something that would come from the administration.
But based on your experience thus far, are there items that you would suggest to those higher ups around eligibility?
So I think that there are always families who want to enroll their children in this program that are not able to. And I think they share those concerns with their state legislators and the administration. And I think it really comes down to a decision of leadership, of our state leadership, as to whether additional students should be added. But my job and my team's job is to focus on serving the students effectively who are in the program, and that's what our concentration is.
Okay, I respect that.
Thank you.
What I'm trying to understand is if we're only serving 137 out of 42,000, could eligibility guidelines play a role in why those numbers aren't higher?
Okay, so I think I'm following what you're saying.
Okay.
So in terms of how we communicate about student eligibility and whether it's clear to parents which students are eligible, there has been a lot of work that we have done to help clean up some of the language around student eligibility, working with the state legislature, and we have made improvements to some cleanup as to the law and rules to make that crystal clear. We do have a number of families who apply each year who are not eligible, but I think there's, especially with the work of our partners out there, the advocacy organizations, the parent groups, they help really inform parents about who's eligible and who's not. So I think we're seeing that parents are grasping that at a higher level, and it's actually pretty clear in terms of who's eligible and who's not. There's not any gray area. It's either you are or you aren't.
I wonder, Rebecca, could you talk a little bit about some of those students that are not eligible and what are the things that are currently keeping them from being eligible in terms of common trends?
So the biggest thing we hear about is families of students who are enrolled in private homeschools. They want to enroll their children in the program, they're not eligible. Also, students who don't have one of the qualifying disabilities. So right now it's only open to students with one of 9 qualifying disabilities, and there are a lot more disabilities out there that are not covered in the program. So we get a lot of applications from students with other non-qualifying disabilities.
On the first one, so right now the program requires that the student be enrolled in a public school the year prior to enrolling in this program,
Yes, the
correct?
full school year.
And then in terms of the eligible disabilities, give us some examples of ones that are not currently covered that might resonate with the board.
Other health impairments is a big one. That's one of the ones we see the most common. So
Health impairments.
other health impairments, yeah. Specific learning disability would be another one.
So to my question, are there, and this, let me just ask the question, could there be modifications made to those 2 areas that you just mentioned that open up eligibility in a broader sense that allow more families to participate?
If the legislature were to do that, there would be more students participating in the program.
Okay, I think that's where I'm trying to get to, is the solution to that dilemma. Thank you.
Very welcome.
I do think, just in conjunction with Mr. Cobbin's question, the point you made earlier too about understanding the services that these students that are participating and what they're receiving or not receiving, that's also something that we want to continue to try to understand better. So whatever the board can do to be helpful in terms of outreach to parents that are participating currently, and just again educating us as to sort of the current challenges in the program, how we might expand it, how we might make it stronger for the students and families currently serving. I know this board will be an advocate to support that work.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We are scheduled to take a very brief 10-minute break. And when we come back, we'll move into the master plan. Thank you. We need everyone to return to their seats. Can you hear me? Everyone, please return. The meeting will begin in 1 minute. Would the audience please sit down? Audience participants, please sit down. The meeting is called to order. The next agenda item is the Master Plan Mid-Year Progress Update from Ms. Amy Owen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good afternoon. I'm Amy Owen, Director of Policy and Research for the State Board of Education. I'm here to give y'all a midpoint update on the master plan that you adopted on final reading at our July 2018 meeting. So this is, as you know, a master plan that will run from July of 2018 through June of 2019. So this is a good point to pause and reflect on what we've accomplished in the last 7 months or so since this plan was adopted and what we need to take up in the remaining time until we come up on our next master plan. So just as a reminder that all these priority areas are based on your vision, they're carried out under Sarah's leadership, and none of the work, I'm the one up talking about it today, but none of this work would have been possible without a really dedicated staff from top to bottom. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. If it is somebody else's area of expertise, I may call one of my wonderful colleagues up. So thank you. As a start, we have 4 strategic priority areas in our master plan. They are high expectations and positive learning environments, great teachers and leaders, high quality school options, and public engagement and oversight. We think of this as a goal focused on students, teachers, schools, and our own work in state governance. I'm going to run through briefly what each of these goals are, and then our progress to date on the benchmarks that we set for 2018-19. One note is that these priority areas are largely the same as the ones that were adopted back in 2016 for our master plan. They've been consistent over time. That's because the board's 5-year strategic goals for students have stayed the same, of trying to achieve being in the top half of states on NAEP, having an average ACT composite score of 21, and having the majority of high school graduates from the class of 2020 earn some kind of post-secondary credential. So these do remain similar over time, but the annual benchmarks are what change and what we're really tracking progress on. This is the little coding scheme that you'll see throughout this presentation. A little green check mark indicates that a benchmark has been completed. Blue circle means it is in progress and on track. And when that's an empty red circle, either it has not yet started or it needs additional focus. This might not be a bad thing. It might just be like it's not timely for a certain project to begin. But that's how we'll be looking at our progress for this past 6 months or so. Our first strategic priority area is about high expectations and positive learning environments. This is the statement that we worked on with all our members to help identify what this priority area really means to us. It means both a focus on rigorous academic standards and supporting student success in a safe learning environment with high quality instruction. Our first benchmark here was about considering any potential changes to our ELA and math standards. We talked about this last in July. As you all know, typically our standards are reviewed every 6 years in math, science, ELA, and social studies. After the board adopts standards on final reading, the state selects a list of textbooks and instructional materials that school districts can adopt from. And about 1.5 years later, the aligned standards, along with instructional materials, are implemented in classrooms. What happened in 2016 as the state moved to more Tennessee-specific academic standards was that 6-year cycle got thrown off. Standards were adopted and textbooks were not aligned for another several years. That caused a pretty big problem for our districts, especially in ELA and math, when they had these new revised standards but no state-approved and vetted aligned instructional materials.
So what we were originally thinking in July when we put this master plan together was maybe we can do like an interim checkpoint review of ELA and math standards to get them back on track. What we came to find is that doing so could have some unintended consequences. Every time we review standards, that also means that things need to change about the assessment. Which questions do we have that are reliable and valid? Which grade levels are they for, and exactly how are they phrased? So reviewing standards more frequently than every 6 years could have caused some real challenges with our assessment, and that's obviously the last thing any of us would like to do. So what we're trying to do now, how we've thought about revising this benchmark, is that in coordination with our district partners, we've talked to Dale Lynch at TOS, and with department input, finalize a plan to get these two standards areas back in their own separate adoption cycles and back on track with textbook adoption. Nathan and I have been working with some legislative colleagues about a potential fix that would allow a one-time exemption for math and ELA to be reviewed a little bit longer than every 6 years, with the plan of getting them back on track with their textbooks. We'll know more about that in the coming months. If for some reason it's not able to work out this year, we'll go back to the drawing board. We've got a couple other options, but we'd like to have a plan in place by the end of March so we can clearly communicate, training for standards and purchasing textbooks. These are major decisions for districts that have both academic and financial ramifications, so we want to be able to communicate clearly about what the plan is there. Questions, because I know that's a change. Okay, great. Our second area is around positive learning environments. This was something that y'all were really discussing heavily in the spring and summer of this past year, especially in regards to school safety and students feeling comfortable at school, feeling like they got the support they need from every adult in their building, from teachers and counselors and leaders. One thing that we did was we had a presentation from Mike Herman with the Office of Safe and Supportive Schools at the department at our October meeting around the results of a statewide security audit that touched every single school in the state to identify ways to use some grant money from the legislature to improve the safety of our school facilities. What we still plan to do at workshop presentations in May and July is use school climate data from that Tennessee Educator Survey that Aaron and Jason were talking about to look at what is the climate in our schools? Are our teachers feeling comfortable there? Do they feel like it's a safe environment for them and their students? How do they feel about engagement with families? And seeing if there's anything there that can inform our policies or recommended practices. We also would like to have a presentation on the revised school counseling standards that this board adopted about 1.5 years ago, I want to say, to ensure that counselors are aware of these standards and that they're able to focus on the highest impact duties that they can do on behalf of students. So having an effective school-wide counseling program, working with students one-on-one, rather than something that they've often reported doing is, more administrative tasks, planning and coordinating testing, that kind of thing. So those are some things that we still plan to bring you. You haven't seen them yet, but it definitely is in the works. If you guys are comfortable, we'll move to our strategic priority area 2, great teachers and leaders. Here our charge is pretty clear. We'll establish policies to ensure all students have access to great teachers and great leaders. We have 3 benchmarks here. One is educator preparation. As you know, this board is charged with approving every Tennessee education preparation provider, or EPP. There are over 40 in the state, and they're on a 7-year approval cycle. Legislatively, our board is charged with producing an annual teacher prep report card. I will tell you that Dr. Catherine McKeldin has been burning the midnight oil to make sure this is prepared to launch on February 15th, which is our legislatively required deadline. We will share results with you at that time. We've also been working closely with an advisory council of representatives from public, private, and alternative certification providers, as well as other community stakeholder groups, again, TOS, also the Tennessee Association of School Personnel Administrators, folks who work in HR, to make this tool as useful as it can possibly be. We'll also share what updates we've made for the 2018 report card, as well as what's sort of on the table for what we're tentatively calling a design refresh for 2019. One change for this year is that we're going to have a short, non-scored module on leader preparation. This is the first time we've added that to the report card. It will give information on how many completers a program has had and some of their basic demographics. What we'd like to do in partnership with Dr. Grissom and others in the leader prep community is think about what are the other appropriate metrics to use to evaluate a leader prep program? I know it's really common for teachers, I know including one of our board members, to secure an administrator's license but decide to be in the classroom for several more years or take an assistant principal role. So how do we then evaluate the preparation they received if they're not immediately turning around becoming a principal? We've worked really closely with the Tennessee, the Conference of Teacher Education in the state. They are unfortunately having their conference right now, today and tomorrow, so we're missing out on that opportunity to speak with them directly before the report card launch, but we have plans to loop back with them and collect any feedback in the next several weeks. And we're really excited to share this tool. I think it's been useful for driving conversations with stakeholders. We also plan to use the data that we collect from this report card to produce ancillary reports throughout the year based on Tennessee-specific educator prep data. One that will be coming up in the later part of the spring is a report on teacher diversity at the Tennessee educator prep level and potential action steps to increase diversity in educator preparation. So questions so far? Okay. Our next area is educator licensure. Again, this board is responsible for setting the requirements to earn and maintain a teaching license in Tennessee. One thing that's been a big change recently is that as of this January 1st, all candidates who wish to become a teacher need to take the EdTPA performance-based assessment, in addition to the Praxis 2 subject-specific content knowledge assessments for their area. This is an empty circle just because this is brand new. This was just effective this January 1st, but we do want to work with our EPPs to consider how EdTPA implementation is going, how the cut scores are looking, any challenges that their candidates are having, or strong practices that we want to put into policy, and consider any methods of revising our EdPrep policy as needed. What we continue to do is work with the Department of Education, districts, and EPPs to think about our licensing structures. And I know this is one area where Sarah has a lot of experience and can provide great guidance for us as a staff. What we were able to do is on the annual district survey that the department sends to every central office, add a few questions to their module for HR professionals, asking about what are their common challenges with licensure. We actually provided them with a link to the EdPrep rule that y'all approved on first reading in October and asked if there was any feedback they'd like to provide the state board. I've been working through that qualitative data. It looks like far and away the biggest concern is getting people in and licensed who were teachers in another state, but it feels like there's a lot of hoops to jump on that. We're actually holding off on final reading of that item until May to allow both data analysis of those issues, some conversations between us and the department. We have one of those set up next week. And to have our licensure and preparation subcommittee of this board meet in April and consider that data more closely as well as any potential changes. So I haven't set the date yet. I'm going to try to do that right after this meeting, but all of y'all are welcome to attend. I know our educator licensure subcommittee is typically 4 folks, but if anybody else is interested, you'd be more than welcome to attend.
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Bob.
I think I've said in the past that I think the biggest challenge we have is getting quality teachers, highly qualified teachers into the classroom. I think that's the biggest shortage we have to affect the improvements we need in education. And I don't know if this is the right benchmark to look at this. It's the closest one I came to. But
Sure.
What might we do, or how can we think about whether we bring in retirees, whether we do something within the licensure program? And I'm not saying skip the licensure program, but to encourage people, good quality people, to get into the teaching environment.
That's a great question. That's one of the reasons I was so excited to get this survey data back, that it's direct comments and quotes from the people who every day are trying to hire the best they possibly can into their district. There were a couple issues they surfaced where I had thought, oh, we've addressed that issue before, and they introduced a nuance to it that I wouldn't have known just from the state level. So I'm really looking forward to using that information and a little ad hoc licensure working group of our team and the department's Office of Educator Licensure to pull out more of those areas that we maybe hear through anecdotes or through the grapevine that we kind of heard, oh, it's so hard to get out-of-state teachers, but what exactly is the challenge? Is it about their assessment? Is it about something that they're missing? What's the problem here? So I think getting that clear information from the people who deal with this day-to-day is really going to benefit us.
I think the other piece to this, too, is that it has to be a multifaceted approach to ensuring that we have this pipeline of teachers. and I know that when I meet with the directors of schools where that I represent, I'm often talking about their role. You know, you have to help the pipeline of students who are, frankly, perhaps interested and would be great teachers, be encouraged to go that route as opposed to discouraged, because the truth is there is a lot of discouragement that happens. And at the last Director Study Council I attended for the Upper Cumberland, I asked them about that. You know, you have this ready-made potential workforce right in front of you, and you're trying to do everything you can to prepare them for these other job sectors. What about even encouraging them for education? So I think we all have to be a part of the narrative. We have to look at all these different solutions, because it's not just one, it's a multifaceted approach as far as I'm concerned. Any other comments?
Just real quickly, so I do think this is an area that I'm excited to dig into this next year, both the licensure and preparation connections, because there's so much of our policy work that governs, you know, what qualifications teachers must have before they get into the classroom and then to stay in the classroom. So I think both trying to balance those entry requirements and have meaningful sort of bars for entry, but also probably in some ways, most importantly, how you stay in the profession and advance as a teacher. I think we haven't done enough to look at sort of how we could think about the apprentice license, the professional license, and you know, as Dr. Grissom was showing, I mean, there's just already so many challenges in keeping teachers once you get them in the classroom that I think we have to make sure we're sort of walking an appropriate line in terms of entry as well as advancement. And I think it's a broader conversation than even just you know, the out of state, but that's certainly one that we hear a lot. And there's a number of other things that I think in licensure we could begin to address as a board thoughtfully over the next year. I was expecting to hear from Mr. Edwards. Looks like he's ready.
Looks like he's ready.
Well, I will say that we're going to be having some conversation. We're going to have some conversations that are going to be in conflict with each other on one of the things tomorrow, because we do want highly effective, highly skilled teachers. And then there's another argument that we need to set the standards at a level that we can get teachers in the classroom, which infers whether they're highly or not. We just need the body. So, but I want to, but that can be tomorrow. Can we go back to Mr. Eby's question on how do we get people who have a world of knowledge to where they can get the pedagogy skills without having to go through, get them in front of a classroom and then donate to their world of knowledge to society? I mean, we've talked about this. In some, it's legal, and in some very few communities, they've taken advantage of it, but not nearly compared to the shortages we have out there. If we think about physics, we got a lower physics. Well, we got guys that can, men and women who can flat know physics. Give them some skills of teaching.
Mm-hmm. I know one thing that we've been working with the folks from Knoxville on is this idea of an adjunct occupational license, where somebody who is really steeped in a certain career area could have a way to become a teacher for a few subjects that are really in line with their areas of expertise. That's one thing that I think is going to be included on final reading of this item. So can I follow up with you on that? All right. Thank you. Any others here? The third benchmark within great teachers and leaders is really following along this trajectory. First, we need to prepare teachers, then we need to make sure they're licensed, and then in some circumstances, it may turn out that folks make decisions that are potentially not ideal for them staying in the classroom. So this area is on teacher licensure discipline. This board is also charged with reprimanding, suspending, revoking an educator's license for an array of potential misconduct. The legal team has brought on a new staff attorney, Hannah McCann, who will help ensure that cases are acted upon in a timely manner. So now the caseload, when a director of schools reports that somebody has had some sort of action that may lead to consequences on their license, that caseload is split between two attorneys, Hannah and Brittany Kendrick. Additionally, the legal team is in the process of hiring a part-time paralegal to support both the staff attorney and Brittany, who's our assistant general counsel, and reduce time spent on administrative and case management tasks so that when districts are flagging that there's been an issue, our staff is able to turn those around really promptly and ensure that those individuals who have had some kind of issue have an appropriate action on their license. The legal team is also in the process of refining our internal case review meetings to ensure that that process is in alignment with UAPA, which are the standards for these administrative proceedings. These changes are reflected in the licensure discipline rule revision, which is on first reading tomorrow, and will be followed by corresponding changes to the licensure discipline policies at our May and July meetings. Finally, stakeholder engagement in this area is key and ongoing. As of yesterday, Sarah and Lillian were sharing at the TOS conference with directors of schools about what kinds of actions are licensure actions, so things like inappropriate relationships with a student or things of that really severe nature, versus a personnel action that can be handled at the district level, so perhaps general ineffectiveness or something of that nature. And additionally, last November, the staff attorneys gave a presentation at the Tennessee School Boards Association legal workshop on reporting requirements and investigations, and they're continuing to reach out to stakeholders in 2019. They've presented to groups like the Middle Tennessee instructional coaches and principals, the Middle and First Tennessee Superintendent Study Councils, and discussed at every day in the district that you all have been on that has had a Superintendent Study Council meeting with it. So they've also shared at the TASPA conference, those school personnel administrators. So this area is really key to making sure all of the stakeholders in the pipeline are aware of their responsibilities, because as a board at the state level, unless something's shown up on the front page of your local newspaper, we don't have a way of knowing about some of these scenarios. It's really incumbent on directors of schools to report to the Office of Educator Licensure, who then sends the report to us and flags their license.
Just real quickly, I want to acknowledge that Dale Lynch is here. We've called you out a couple times, but I appreciate so much his partnership because, as Amy said, it's so important that we work closely with our leaders at the school district across our state to ensure that for the safety of students, we're acting as a unified front in terms of taking action both locally in terms of the employment decisions, but also the state licensure actions that sometimes are also warranted based on whatever the case may be. And I think particularly in some of the media coverage that we've seen in the last couple of weeks, I think it underscores again how important it is to be working together to just make sure for the safety of students that when there is the need to take action, that we're working closely to have those issues reported to the state. And I just appreciate your partnership, Dale, and the superintendents that you represent.
Yes, sir.
The last phrase and the last bullet point, including reporting requirements, we may have, but I can't recall a disciplinary action against someone who failed to report to us. And yet, they are every bit as culpable as the person that they're supposed. We've got to start taking that role seriously. And unless we do, they won't.
Just for the record, we've taken action once in recent years, and you're right. I think the law that passed last year does underscore the need for directors to report, which is why, again, I think it's so important to work closely with them so they understand, without a doubt, what their responsibilities are. There may be a few more of those cases coming as we kind of uncover over the next few months and the cases that are underway. But I think it's more than anything, we want to make sure they know what their responsibilities are, and then part of that is the need to report within 30 days. And I do think they're more clear than ever based on the outreach that our team has done.
Here's a question that's off the deal, but I don't know when I'd ask it. If a administrator offers a person the option of either resigning or being fired, just resign and go on, is that a violation?
It depends on what the circumstance is.
If it's a fireable, if it's something that we would otherwise yank their license.
If it is a licensure matter rather than a personnel matter.
If it's a licensure matter and they say, well, you go ahead and resign and
Yeah, so if they give the option to resign in lieu of termination, they're still required under our board rules to report that. So regardless if it's a resignation in lieu of termination, a flat-out termination, suspension, we interpret our rules to include administrative leave under its suspension, which is all part of the new revisions to the rule that you will see tomorrow. So that's all required on our rule to be reported within 30 days. Okay.
And Madam Chair, also just from a legislative perspective as well, last year there were 4 new laws put into place, one of which prohibits local districts from entering into agreements that would keep such an arrangement secret, which used to be done. That used to be done where a person could resign and that arrangement would be kept secret. That is now against the law. So definitely the legislature has weighed in a very strong way on this matter.
Thank you for adding that, Nathan.
If we are feeling good on great teachers and leaders, I will switch over to high quality school options. No, it's really important, just making sure we can get to all 4 areas. Our goal here is to advance policies that support all students having access to high-quality schools regardless of zip code, prior achievement, or demographics. And our work in this area has several benchmarks. One is on charter school authorization. The state board, as you all know, is the LEA for 3 schools where the board has approved authorized them on appeal. Part of our requirements are that both the annual authorizer report and annual authorizer fee report are published annually, and those were published on time by the state board staff, Tess Stovall's team with Allie Gaffey, last fall, and they're currently available on our website. The oversight and monitoring of both the authorized charter schools that currently are in operation, one more is coming online next school year, are ongoing. The annual site visits required under State Board Policy 6.500 are scheduled for both schools this spring. State board staff have regular touch points with both schools around topics ranging from special populations to federal programs, data management, and finance via a reporting calendar and scheduled check-ins. The first pre-opening meeting with the KIPP Nashville Middle School has occurred, and the pre-opening work will continue until that school opens in 2019. Anecdotally, I'll say we all visited the KIPP Antioch Elementary School this morning, and just from the comments and general takeaways, we were so impressed with the organization, the focus of the teachers and leaders, and some really, really cute kindergartners. So it was a wonderful visit this morning to our state board authorized school. Our second benchmark is around charter school rules and policies that helps implement rules and policies around high quality authorization across the state. So not just what the board does as an authorizing body, but the standards set for authorizers across Tennessee. The state board staff monitored implementation of the quality authorizing standards in each appeal that was received by the board this fall. In other words, when we receive an appeal, the staff looks to see if quality authorizing standards were followed by the district in each case. It will continue to evaluate implementation of quality standards in future appeals. Additionally, the state board staff will review annual authorizer reports that are submitted to the Department of Ed for alignment to those standards. The authorizer fee rule that you all approved on final reading in September of last year will be effective on April 11th. The first reporting requirement for the rule this year is the submission of a projected charter school office budget for the 2019-20 school year. This is a requirement of every school district that authorizes charter schools statewide. And that's due to the Department of Ed by August 1st, and it is the first time any district is required to do that, but it is a new statewide requirement. The second reporting requirement this year will be the report of expenses charged to the authorizer fee for the 2018-19 school year, and that is due to the department by December 1st. Okay. Questions on high-quality school options? Our final strategic priority area, and this is primarily in Nathan James' team, is public engagement and oversight. We commit to collaborative governance, effective oversight, and engagement with the citizens of Tennessee. And I will say that this is an area where the first one gets a green check mark, but all of this work is ongoing. There's never a moment where we say, okay, we're done collaborating with other people. So these are going to stay as blue circles for the foreseeable future. One of the areas that was accomplished this October was the annual BEP Review Committee report that our staff led in the production of. Historically, the BEP Review Committee has championed educator compensation, things like funding the 11th and 12th month of insurance, the inclusion of RTI in the BEP formula, and increased technology funding, as well as a greater focus on school counselors. The Review Committee is an important advocacy and advisory body that encompasses representatives from many state and local agencies. In addition, the staff of the state board sits on over 15 boards, commissions, task forces, and blue ribbon panels, and that's just Nathan alone. These range from statutorily required organizations and committees to scholarship and cross-governance initiatives for all things related to education and the workforce. Our annual joint meeting with THEC has become increasingly valuable. In 2018, you all, along with THEC, adopted a joint resolution committing to the goal of increasing the number of third graders reading on grade level, which was delivered to the new administration and the education committee members. In addition, our board members are active in taking on roles on the state board subcommittees for charter schools and licensure and preparation. Bob also sat on our teacher prep report card advisory council, and we're really grateful for all the additional time that you put in above and beyond our quarterly meetings. In the area of effective oversight, the legal charge of the board is quite varied and broad. We need to faithfully execute our mission. We have close partnerships with lawmakers to help in the crafting of law and the creation of rules. The board's ability to confirm, what we often hear from districts and what are our personal opinions and different information we hear. We need to consider all those different sources and consider how reliable they are. We've been building out our research capacities in recent years. We were fortunate that the legislature provided us a research position that was previously filled by Spencer. Now Catherine's in that position, so that we're able to identify what is useful and reliable information for making policy decisions and what maybe has some gaps or some flaws in research or methodologies. We're also really grateful, obviously, in this area for our partnership with Terra. I think you could see from our earlier presentation the level of depth that they go to in their research and how it can help uncover important findings. Finally, the board conducts a periodic review of all of our rules and policies. We have an ongoing audit cycle to make sure that every item, every rule or policy is looked at a minimum of every 2 years by somebody with that area of expertise, either on our staff or at the Department of Ed. That doesn't mean we change everything every 2 years, because that would be very confusing for everyone, but that we're checking them for, is this still effective? Is it still using appropriate modern terminology? Or have we found some potential issues where it could be updated? Finally, in terms of board member engagement, you all get all the green check marks. Our board members were exceptionally engaged over the summer and fall. In 2018, we held 2 days in the district in the 1st Congressional District, 1 in the 3rd, with the 4th and 2nd District also represented, and 1 in the 5th and 7th Congressional Districts. This outreach, coupled with the continuous interactions that you all have with directors of schools through the superintendent study councils, really helps develop and maintain relationships with some of our key partners. In 2018, 30 new legislators were elected. That was the largest turnover since Reconstruction. You guys can know where I get my historical facts from Nathan. Members and staff met with 26 of the 30 members in their respective districts across the state, and there's no other agency or board that can say the same. And the board has also visited our authorized charter schools in Memphis and just this morning in Nashville. So with that, I'll briefly turn to our plan for developing the 2019-20 master plan, unless there's any comments so far. Okay. As we did last year, I think it worked pretty well. In April, the staff will send members a survey to gather your priorities for the 2019-20 master plan. We'll spend some time compiling those responses and adding suggestions from each of our teams. In June, we'll work one-on-one with the members to finalize priorities and revise drafts. And then in July, we'll have a presentation very similar to this, where I'll go over the achievements toward the 2018-19 master plan at the workshop, and then the 2019-20 master plan will be up for a vote on first and final reading at that board meeting. I will note that the 2019-20 master plan will be the 5th year of a master plan based on our current 5-year student outcome goals. So I know some folks say, how often do those student achievement goals change? When the master plan was set In 2016, the goal was to have it to be a 5-year plan. So this would be the last of the school years under that, under those goals. So that'll be a great moment to reflect as we close out the 1920 school year on what's been achieved, what maybe is still left to do, and if we want to take any different approaches moving forward. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Amy, I do want to thank you for being the spokesperson for the for the department and for the rest of the senior team. This work is really a body of work that encompasses the entire team on our staff, and there's no way that the board could accomplish what it accomplishes without the great work of each and every one of you. But thank you for being the spokesperson for everyone. And Brittany, thank you for coming up and clarifying.
Thank you for the assist.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Moving into the next agenda item, Charter School Annual Report. Ms. Tess Stovall, and she's accompanied by...
Yes, I have my colleague Allie Gaffey here because we are excited today to share our first annual charter school report. As many of you all know, this has really been almost 5 years in the making that the state board was allowed to be an appellate authorizer in 2014 and really have been building towards the day where we have authorized charter schools and we are able to report out on the performance of those charter schools. So the purpose of the annual report is really twofold. Number one, as Amy spoke to earlier, all authorizers in the state are required to do an annual report on the performance of their portfolio. Secondly, it's within our quality authorizing standards. It's a best practice of authorizers to, number one, be providing written feedback to their schools annually on their performance, and then secondly, to make sure it's transparent and available to the public and other stakeholders who might need it. So just a quick recap on where we are in terms of the board's authorized charter schools. We have 3 authorized schools. We have 1 school, which is in Memphis, on Bluff City High School, operated by Green Dot. It's currently serving 9th and 10th graders. KIPP Antioch College Prep, which you all saw this morning, is located in Nashville and currently serving kindergartners. And as Amy mentioned and as we discussed this morning, we have our 3rd operated charter school under KIPP Nashville, which will be a middle school, which will open in August. So for the remainder of this presentation, we are going to be walking through the state board's performance framework based on performance data from 2017-18. So for context, the only school we're going to be talking about today is Bluff City because that was the only operating school that we had last year. The performance framework is really broken down into 3 key areas: academic performance, financial performance, and organizational performance. The vast majority of the data that we're going to talk through today is in the academic performance section. We will share some updates around financial and organizational performance, but I will also explain why that information tends to be lagging simply because of the data that we use for those input areas. I think also before we dive into data, important context here, we're talking about a school that operated 1 grade level and had about 150 students and was in its first year of operation. So, really when we're thinking about evaluating a school, of course we want to be looking at year 1, but when we get into years 2, 3, 4, and we're really seeing a track record of performance, either positive or negative, that's when we really start having those, positive conversations with the school of you are on track for renewal, or potentially not so positive conversations with the school. So in 2016-17, the Bluff City High School was evaluated across 3 key buckets in academic performance. They were evaluated in first, student academic achievement. So we have proficiency, we have growth, and then we have chronic absenteeism. They were evaluated based on their comparative performance against how they performed against Shelby County schools. And then thirdly, they're evaluated on school culture. Next year, when the school does receive a letter grade from the Department of Education, the academic achievement bucket will no longer be broken down into proficiency, growth, and chronic absenteeism. It will be replaced with whatever letter grade that school receives. And I do think it's important to note, I know that Mr. Darnell and I were talking about this earlier today, of when we're thinking about KIPP Elementary, which only has kindergarten, how will we as a board be looking at their performance? So next year, when we're having this similar conversation, we will be looking primarily at those school culture indicators. We will have a chronic absenteeism rate that we'll be able to evaluate. But certainly, when you're in kindergarten and first grade, you don't have any state assessments. So you're really, we will be having lots of conversations with them about their internal benchmarking and how they're tracking. But from a formalized performance framework standpoint, we'll really be looking at those school culture data. So for Bluff City, when we looked at the first bucket around student academic achievement, we saw some mixed results. So first, their ratings on absolute performance in Algebra 1 and English 1, in accordance with our performance framework, would received a falls far below rating. However, when we looked at growth, so how are they growing the students that we know came into the school very far behind, they exceeded the standard on our performance framework. They got a TVOS level of a 5. Additionally, when we looked at chronic absenteeism, they got a rating of does not meet. It's important to put this specific chronic absenteeism rate in context. High school chronic absenteeism rate statewide is incredibly high. The chronic absenteeism rate for 9th through 12th graders across the state is 17%. In Shelby County, for 9th through 12th graders, it's 21% chronic absenteeism. And for Metro Nashville Public Schools for 9th through 12th graders, it's 29%. So absolutely, we believe it's important that students need to be in school to learn. And we are having these conversations often with Bluff City in particular, knowing that they're dealing with a high school population that as soon as you're able to drive yourself, it makes it easier not to come to school. And I know that they are doing a lot of interventions to get students to school, but I think this is one data point in a larger statewide conversation around chronic absenteeism.
Ms. Tucker?
Yeah. Do you want us to interrupt or no?
Please.
Okay, so I just, as a member of the subcommittee, and we've had a conversation about some of this data, I just want to raise something that I think we talked about back when we were looking at charter applications of schools too, and that's this whole absolute performance versus growth, or absolute performance and growth. I don't want to versus it. And so when I first saw this, I was like, oh my gosh, falls far below, that's terrible. And then I saw that they have the highest possible level of growth. And so I guess the questions that I think I know the answers, but do we know an average of how far behind these kids came to this high school? And then have you had conversations with them about where they are in terms of getting to an absolute performance level that would meet expectations?
Yeah, so we definitely know based on data that the school had is that, number one, the vast majority of their students are being pulled from middle schools that are currently within the Achievement School District. So we know that those students are coming from schools that have chronically underperformed. And then when they did internal benchmarking, they had a very large percentage. I'm not going to give you an exact percentage off the top of my head. Very large percentage of students who were reading and in math in the K through 6th grade level. And we're talking about 9th graders. And so we are actually just recently received their data, internal data from that they're tracking this year as we in advance of our site visit. We absolutely are pushing them to say growth is great. And we absolutely, especially on a first year, we want to see that high growth. But ultimately we need for those students to be successful to be at a point where proficiency is something that we're going to be grading to. And we're hoping that that is going to happen in the next year or two. And I think we feel confident based on what we've seen and the conversations we've had that they're really doubling down and focusing on continuing to move the students who are very far behind, but also to reach places where we want them to be in terms of proficiency.
Okay, and I would imagine statewide, nationally, when you get to 9th grade and you're reading at a kindergarten level, the level 5, again, it's as high as it goes, but you're going to need a whole lot of level 5 in that 4-year chunk to get those kids to have any chance. Really.
Absolutely. And I think even when we had a conversation with the school, even in January, they're trying to group the students even into even smaller groups. I think one reflection they had is that originally they were grouping all of their tier 3 students together. And what they realized is that it's a very different instructional conversation when you have someone who's maybe on the K3 level than it is someone who's on the 5th, 6th level or even beyond. And so I think even in our conversations in January, they're continuing to reflect on how do they really provide those intensive supports to the students that they know are very far behind.
Thank you.
Mr. Edwards?
Mr. Edwards. This is going to be more of an editorial than a question, but if we were to take the level 5 trajectory and continue it, do you think that at the end of the 12th grade, at that highest trajectory, that those kids would be at a position to leave there and go and adequately perform in some post-high school training program? It's a rhetorical question, but the point is, if we can't accomplish that, then we may be doing yeoman's work in the world of of education, but those kids are being failed all the same.
Absolutely.
That's it.
Just piggyback on that, I mean, a question that we may need to ask as a state is how kids got promoted to 9th grade when they're like at the sight word level, right? I mean, they didn't, thankfully the school is there and trying to do all of this, but those kids weren't given any favors by being pushed along. And so I don't know what we do about that, but something needs to be done.
And it is very striking when we're in a kindergarten school today and really seeing strong foundations of learning, and then you're seeing 9th graders that are coming in so far behind, and they just have a lot of work to do. So next, we compared them to how Shelby County performed on Algebra 1 and English 1. Again, ADA does not meet the standard here, but I think to your point, Wendy, potentially this shows you, just relatively speaking, where they're coming from and where the neighboring schools are coming from in terms of achievement on Algebra 1 and English 1 proficiency. The school culture indicators are ones that we look at because we really think that there's more that goes on into a school than just the data, the academic assessment data, that we really want to be looking holistically around school culture. Suspension rate, they were at a falls far below standard, and I do think that this in particular is an indicator that we want to be looking at the data to make sure we've set the threshold at the right place. Statewide, out-of-school suspension rates for all students, they didn't have disaggregated data available publicly at this point, was around 9-10%. Similarly, Shelby County's all student suspension rates of all out-of-school suspension was around 11%. So again, I think as we are beginning to use our performance framework, we will be doing gut checks based on publicly available data to make sure that we're setting the right thresholds. But certainly, to the point earlier about chronic absenteeism, we can't have students out of the building and then expect them to perform academically. Student attrition rate, this is we will be looking at schools and say, based on October 1 of your previous year, and then October 1 of the next year, how many students did you lose for whatever reason? And high schools do tend to have a higher attrition rate, again, and I think in a city where there's choice, I think that leads to a higher attrition rate. I will say that when we ran this data, I do feel bad for Bluff City because they are literally a 1/10 of a point from meeting the standard on this. Our threshold for meeting the standard is 24.9% attrition, and so they're at a 25%. But they actually, this was a data point they really appreciated us running for them. This is actually something they weren't previously tracking in the way that we do. And so they, from a Green Dot Network perspective, were excited to find out how we're tracking this and something that they were hoping to be useful in the future. And the teacher retention rate, this is something that I know Sarah and I talked a lot about, the importance of retaining good teachers. I think this is one that, a small in count of 9 teachers, when you have the vast majority of them returning, you did have 3 who did not return. This, I think this rating is an indicator of having a very small in count.
And can you share with us, I'm sure you've had conversations with Bluff City about how they're going to address the culture stuff, because honestly, the culture stuff, I get that they're really close to what's happening around them too, but this stuff bothers me more than the absolute achievement, just because when you're not there or when you leave, and then three out of 9 teachers, I get there's a low end number, but 3 out of 9 teachers leaving is still concerning to me. What have they shared that you can share with us about how they're going to make these numbers, what improvement they're going to make?
Yeah, so in particular on the teacher retention front, I think this goes to the conversation the board has been having today of how do you find really great teachers and get them to really want to stay in your school. So I know that in conversations with the principal, they're really anticipating and trying to staff earlier in the year and get those, secure those spots early so that the great teachers are not getting taken by Shelby County or other charter schools. I know that this in particular was a real something that the principal himself wanted to focus on this year going into next year. I think that based on just informal conversations, and again, we're doing our site visit in a couple weeks, we'll have more. I think that from a staffing perspective, they're in a really good place for this year and moving into next year. And then from an attrition rate, absolutely. We want them to be keeping their students. I will say that anecdotally, when we're there on the site visit, the kids really enjoy the school. It's clear that teachers and other administrators love the students and vice versa. I think it was a very positive environment, but absolutely really getting them to make sure that they're retaining their students as much as possible. I will say that they do provide transportation, which is not always the case for charter schools, which I think helps.
Just one thing to add too. I think, again, keeping in mind that this is year 1 for this school, and they started on a delayed timeline based on the timeline of an appeal. They really kind of had a short on-ramp into the first year of operation. So we're hopeful to see things improve for the second year, because I think especially on the teacher front, it takes sort of a thoughtful, prolonged interview process to make sure it feels like a fit both for the candidate and for the school. And so I think, again, we'll see, but it seemed like last year when we were talking to them, they had some really exciting plans for how they were going to be doing onboarding with new staff, how they were going to be building culture and sort of teacher leadership opportunities for their existing staff, because just hiring them is step 1, but keeping them is obviously an important second step. So like Tess, I'm excited to be there in a couple weeks to get under the hood a little bit further on the year 2 work, but I do think that played into it. The first year was a short on-ramp and opening.
Is there anyone in an HR capacity that is conducting exit interviews to determine why the 3 left? With a smaller population, I would think that there would be the ability to do that.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I think they know why those 3 teachers left.
Okay. Anything you can share? If not, that's okay.
I just think that when we were there, how about this? I was not surprised that the teachers who left.
I think it's about fit. On both sides.
And that's fine. Yeah. That's a good answer. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I think when we're looking from an overall perspective, the school received and does not meet the rating overall on the academic performance framework when we take everything into account. From a financial performance framework, this information is really driven by their audit, and their audits come in, charter school audits do not come in until December after the conclusion of the school year. So for the 2017-18 school year, we just received their audit, so we're actually working through this performance framework right now. Their enrollment variance is something that we do not need the audit for. This is basically saying, how are they budgeting for their school as it relates to how many students did they actually enroll? And so the fact that they're meeting the standard here says that, look, the school knows how to budget and they're able to meet their enrollment targets when it comes to their budget. So the overall financial rating is pending currently for the school and will be finalized when we complete the review of the audit. The final part of the performance framework is our organizational performance framework. And this is really kind of the all-encompassing part of the performance framework. It's a little, I wouldn't say squishy, but this is saying, did they meet all rules, policies, laws, et cetera? And so here we're looking at different places where we're tracking for compliance around state board rules, state board policies, state and federal law. So we're looking at, are indicators under, are they appropriately serving students with disabilities? Are they appropriately serving English language learners? Are they meeting our reporting requirements when it comes to the reporting calendar? Are they meeting, are they conducting background checks? Do they have appropriate facilities? Are they having emergency operations plans and drills, et cetera? So this is a lot, honestly, of the ongoing work of the staff is monitoring in this area via site visits, via our reporting calendar, via check-in calls with school level staff on special populations. And as you can see here, they are currently meeting the standard on all of the ratings with the exception of the couple of financial ones that have to be done when we get the audit. So overall, the organizational rating is still pending because of the two indicators going on with the audit. So this is where we stand right now. Again, things that we've already covered. But for overall, we will be, what's going to happen next is that we will, once we get the financial performance framework completed and then the organizational performance framework completed, we will update the annual report. And then we're going to look at our intervention policy. So our intervention policy has a table of interventions that will, and to put the school on official notice or any corrective action plans that are necessary as it relates to the intervention policy, and really grounding our work in what our policies and procedures say. As I mentioned, we're doing our annual site visits. We're going to be collecting a lot of the data that we're going to analyze for the organizational parts of the framework. And then finally, we will be conducting end of school year performance meetings. So we conducted one with Bluff City over this past summer where we sit down when we have available TN Ready and TVOS data and say, okay, you're leading into this next school year. How are you going to be really using this data to increase your performance or change your instruction or change your approach just generally? Similar, we'll do the same kind of conversations with KIPP Nashville. I think, the blessing in the curse of annual reports and the timeline is we're sitting right now in February. And so we don't want to obviously be waiting until February to be having some of those conversations with schools. So that's why we do an end of year, kind of before the next school year, at least initial conversation meeting so that we can have, we can be on the record with the school about where they are in terms of a renewal in our performance framework, and they can share with us how are they making adjustments for the next school year. And that's all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions that the board has.
Mr. Eby.
Thank you for this report.
Yeah.
Very complete. Challenging, obviously.
Yes.
And certainly this is year one.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just really, really important that we hold them to the same standards that we hold all the charter schools.
Absolutely.
to.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Great work,
Okay.
as always.
Thank you.
I know you're up next with Dr. Morrison, Ms. Angie Sanders, for the charter renewal appeal.
All right. Yes, thank you, Tess, for that report. I do think, to Mr. Eby's comment, it will be really important to track progress over time and to be clear and consistent. That will be a theme in our comments on this appeal in terms of communication with charter schools. It's critical that we have a strong line of communication with our schools when it comes to the performance of their academics and culture and all of the things that Tess just went through. Before I get into the specifics of this appeal, I want to make sure I note that Angie Sanders, to my left, has joined us in a new role since our last official meeting. I know this is not news to any of you on the board, but for the record and for those watching, we're thrilled to have her as our general counsel, a role that she served several years ago before leaving for Texas and then coming back to join the board in a different capacity before moving into the general counsel role, how long ago now? A month and a half, maybe?
Probably.
Maybe less than that?
Yeah. About a month, probably.
About a month. But we're thrilled to have her in that new relatively new capacity. In terms of the charter appeal that's before you tomorrow from City University Boys in Memphis, As you know, our staff, is in conjunction with the review committee that we've appointed, have been working since the appeal in mid-December to really thoroughly review the record in this case. That included going to Shelby County for a public hearing several weeks ago, as well as, like I said, working very closely with our review committee to look at the details in this case. I want Angie, though, to start with the standard of review, because this is the first non-renewal appeal that we've heard as a board, and I think it's important to understand the standard of review, which is different than the New Start appeals that you've heard in the past. So, Angie, if you'll take just a minute to walk us through that, then I'll go through some of the specifics in terms of my recommendation.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. So on December 14th, 2018, City University Boys submitted an appeal of the non-renewal decision of Shelby County Schools to our board. In an appeal of a non-renewal of a charter school, the state board's standard of review is whether or not the chartering authority's decision was contrary to 4913-122, which you have up on the screen in front of you. This part of the statute states that a chartering authority may non-renew a charter school if the charter school committed a material violation of any conditions, standards, or procedures set forth in the charter agreement, failed to meet or make sufficient progress toward the performance expectations in the charter agreement, or failed to meet generally accepted standards of fiscal management. As Sarah stated, I want to make it really clear that the standard of review here is really different than what we're used to seeing in the New Start appeals that you all have had before you in the past. So in those New Start appeals, the standard of review is whether or not the charter school is in the best interests of the students, the school district, or the community. And so that's a much wider net, and the board has a lot more discretion. Whereas here, we're really looking at whether or not the decision of Shelby County Schools was in accordance with these three areas of statute.
Can I just ask one
Sure.
quick point? So, and that's by a preponderance, right? It's not like a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. That's
yes,
more likely than not that they were correct. I just want to make sure we're clear.
Yes, and based on our de novo review of the record. Right. So with that, Shelby County Schools, with regard to City University Boys, chose to non-renew this school based on the second portion of 4913-122 because, in their opinion, it failed to meet or make sufficient progress toward the performance expectations set forth in the charter agreement. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah to talk more about our review of the record.
Great. Thank you, Angie. Any questions on that before I get into some of the specifics? Okay, as I mentioned before, since the school submitted their appeal in mid-December, we have been working closely as a staff with the review committee to carefully review the full record. That included interviews with school leadership, holding a public hearing in Memphis a couple weeks ago, and collecting public comment. At the conclusion of this work, the state board staff, myself included, did not find evidence that Shelby County erred in its decision-making, nor that the decision was contrary to statute. Specifically, the school's academic data lagged over the last several years, both as measured by Shelby County and their school performance academic framework, as well as state assessments and TVAS. On the Shelby County Academic Performance Framework, charter schools have to receive a composite score of a 3 in academics, operations, and finances for renewal. City University's composite score in academics has been below a 3 since 2015. Additionally, the school is on the priority list, which is based on the state assessment data, in 2014, and it's been on the CUSP list, which is the bottom 10% of all schools, so just above the priority cutoff, in 2013, 2015, and 2017. Finally, in the last 2 years, the school has earned a TVAS of a level 1 and a level 2, respectively. At the public hearing and during the capacity interview, we asked for specific evidence that the school was meeting or making sufficient progress on the academic goals within the charter agreement. The school stated that students were demonstrating mastery on NWEA MAP, which is an interim benchmark, with 60% of students performing in the 60th or 70th percentile. However, when the state board staff evaluated the assessment data that was provided by the school, we did not find evidence of that progress. The school raised arguments throughout the appeal that it did not receive the promised VIP services as outlined in the charter agreement for a payment of 3% authorizer fee to Shelby County over the past few years. However, as Angie mentioned, given the standard of review in this appeal, that issue is outside of the state board's authority on an appeal of this nature. Additionally, the school shared that it faced logistical challenges around testing the last several years. And like many across our state, I have great sympathy regarding those testing challenges. Ultimately, though, in this case, the school appealed to the Department of Education, and that appeal was denied, meaning that the assessment scores do stand for City University boys the last couple years. Finally, the school raised concerns regarding Shelby County's renewal process. And I mentioned this before. It's incredibly important for the district of record to communicate clearly with schools about the non-renewal process. And in this case, again, there were many concerns raised by the school concerning communication from the district. So I just want to read one part of the executive director's report that pertains to this. And I said, quote, while it's clear that Shelby County has made progress toward a strong renewal process with the help of NACSA, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, the process applied to City University missed the mark when it came to the State Board's Quality Authorizing Standard 5D, which states that a quality authorizer clearly communicates to schools the criteria for charter revocation, renewal, and non-renewal decisions that are consistent with the charter agreement, including any policy changes thereto. That said, there was eventually clear communication about the standard for non-renewal regarding both the criteria and the renewal process, though this did not occur until March 2018, which was about a month before the schools were required to submit their renewal application in April of that same year. In order to work towards better alignment with the quality authorizing standards, we believe Shelby County should ensure that it is clearly communicating with schools throughout the charter term regarding criteria for renewal, so that schools are able to act on that information and to improve performance well in advance of any renewal decision. In sum, however, again, after evaluating the entire record, the review committee's recommendation, and the evidence from the public hearing, I conclude that the school has not demonstrated it is meeting or making sufficient progress toward the academic goals within the charter agreement, and therefore it's within Shelby County's statutory authority to non-renew the charter agreement. My recommendation, as you saw in the executive director's report, is to uphold the Shelby County decision to non-renew the charter agreement of City University boys. And I'll stop there and take any questions, but before I do, I just want to note, again, the serious nature of these decisions. This board hears appeals about charter schools on a lot of fronts. Most often, they come to us as new start appeals, which are schools that are not yet in existence. I think in the case of schools that are already in existence, I have particular sympathy and just compassion for the educators that are involved, the leadership, the students and families. It's not a light decision that we make as a board, and it certainly was not a light decision that I made in terms of the executive director's recommendation. But we'll stop there, take any questions. I do want to note, too, we've been in communication with Dr. Robinson, and I do believe he's here with us today. So if you have questions after the workshop, I know he would welcome the chance to talk with you. But let's take a minute now for any questions that you have for us.
Ms. Tucker.
So my first question is sort of procedural, and I probably should know the answer to this, but if this appeal, if we affirm the recommendation of the review committee and of the executive director, or whatever the right terminology is tomorrow, when that motion is made, will this school then close, or not? Would its contract expire at the end of this school year, and so therefore these students would next school year have to be in a different place?
That's correct.
All right. And is there? I remember some late things with Shelby County in the past. Mm-hmm. Is there a process envisioned by Shelby County to serve these students, and how many students are we talking about?
Yep. So they have made some changes since those closure appeals that we heard a couple of years ago, and those were later in the school year in terms of their outreach to families and the work that they do to ensure that these students know their choices in terms of locations for next year. The exact number of students, I'm going to look to Angie or Tess. I think I know it, but I don't want to misspeak. It's 80.
It's in the 80s.
Okay. So and so they do have some process that they think. So, but my worry is, like with a choice system, Shelby County has a lot of choice. If those choices are closed before this appeal is resolved, whether that limits what those kids' options are. I mean, it doesn't change our analysis. I'm just thinking about those families.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, they do have more of a process in place, and they've got more time than they did in the case of the closures that we heard a couple of years ago.
Okay. And then let me just keep asking.
Please
I don't have that
proceed.
many. You mentioned that there was internal MAP testing. And that the school used that as proof of sufficient progress towards performance expectations, I guess. And then you said it very nicely, so you may not want to answer this. You said that your analysis of it did not support that conclusion. Can you give us?
I'll let Tess answer that specifically, but essentially what we were given was student level data, so it hadn't been analyzed when we got it, which made it difficult to assess, but we did attempt to look at that data and make sense of sort of what the performance thresholds were in a trend way. And Tess, I think you can talk probably more about the specifics
I think
there.
when we looked at, we were really looking at, were could we find evidence that 60% of the students were performing in the 60 or 70th percentile on MAP, and we were given reading and math level data? Certainly, I think when we analyze the data wasn't bad. I mean, I think that there is growth happening with the students in the school, but we simply didn't find the evidence that that 60% of the students were performing at a very high level on MAP.
I know it's probably in this material, and I did go through it, but there was a lot. The performance expectations in the charter agreement, what were those, or what was that baseline that everything was? I mean, a 1 and 2 on TVAS probably weren't the expectations, but I'm just curious if there were specific TVAS expectations or
So, and I think that this is, certainly kind of to Sarah's point earlier, that this school in particular and others, there has been a kind of a confluence of things happening throughout the 10-year charter term. So their original charter agreement was with Memphis City Schools. There was a reference to an accountability plan in the charter agreement, which was listed as Exhibit B, but that accountability plan hadn't been developed yet. So it was not in the charter agreement itself. And then shortly thereafter, the signing of the charter agreement was when the demerger occurred. And so there has been a lot happening over that 10-year process. I will say that one of the things we did analyze was the goals that they had set forth in their charter application. The charter application was included in the charter agreement. Specifically, according to state law, the charter agreement must contain all parts of the application. And so not only did we look at how Shelby County has established the performance scorecards, which has come out in the last couple of years that Shelby County does have a performance framework that they're using to analyze data against all of their charter schools, but we did look at the goals contained within the charter agreement, which by reference is the charter application.
And they were not making.
That's correct.
Okay, or Shelby County wasn't in error in saying that they didn't find sufficient progress, I guess is the right way of the lawyer.
Yeah,
way of
Wendy,
saying
if
that.
you want to know what they are, the first one was to increase performance in academic areas as indicated on state and national standardized tests, as to allow at least 80% of our scholars to achieve proficiency, so an 80% proficiency rate. And then the second one was to develop reading skills to allow at least 75% of our scholars to read at or above grade level.
Okay, so yeah, they had some those are pretty straightforward numbers. I have one more and then I'm going to stop. You mentioned the VIP, like they paid for all this stuff that they're saying Shelby County didn't give. And Shelby County had an authorizer fee before the rest of the state, right? Like they had this sort of, but this was under that. So my guess is, it's the lawyer again, like the remedies there would be contractual. They could address that with Shelby County to get some of the money back or whatever contractually. And then a broader remedy would be to attach that authorizer fee to high quality practices and right, legislatively, there could be a legislative fix for that, which wouldn't help them, but in the future it would help.
Yeah, this was one of the few schools in Shelby County that signed on to a charter agreement that included an authorizer fee before there was one required by law. And in their application, it says that in exchange for, or not the application, in their agreement, it says in exchange for the authorizer fee that they would be provided administrative services. It wasn't detailed in the agreement what those services were, and so I think that's part of the disagreement between the school and Shelby County as to whether or not there was some kind of violation there. But you are correct that the state board doesn't really have the authority to litigate that issue. That would be something they would have to take up with Shelby County in a separate matter.
Right. Thank you.
Mr. Eby?
Yes. I had the fortunate opportunity to actually travel to Memphis and attend that public hearing, and I would encourage all board members to participate in these things like this, because first let me say this, I was most impressed with Sarah and her team. Getting to ride in the car with Sarah and Angie. I mean, they were on the phone the whole time working various issues. At lunch, we worked through lunch preparing, and it just goes to show me again what a great staff and how fortunate we are with the team that we have there. But sitting there, and I just sit back in the back and observe the process, and it got gut-wrenching sometimes. I mean, it's a difficult situation. But then I look at specifically the limitations of the law, what the law says, what we're required to do versus one or the other. And I think we have to take that into account. I will say this, I don't know how the vote will go tomorrow, but if the vote does go to not repeal the repeal and not reinstate the charter, my concern, biggest concern, is all about the students. And these 80 students, and I think some of the information that was provided there were the schools that were around the area. Those test scores weren't any better, and at least half the schools around there, the test scores were worse than what's in the University Prep School there. We need to be sure that Shelby County is put on notice that those kids need to go to a school where they're not doing worse than where they're doing right now. And so it's all about the students, and that's the challenge there. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to do that. I do encourage all the board members to participate in things like that in the future.
Thanks, Bob.
Mr. Cobbins.
Thank you. Reading through the information provided by each party in that process, in the hearing, I had a couple of questions about things that I noted that caused me some bit of pause. The first being Shelby County Schools changing the, I think it's the cut score from 3 to 2. No, from 2 to 3.
It was, my understanding, it was a 3 composite versus 3 individually on each of the domains sort of within that composite was the change. Am I saying that right, Angie?
Help me understand.
Yeah, so there was a lot of discussion at the public hearing around some information that was communicated to another one of City University's schools, which was City University Girls, who was up for their 5-year interim review. So there was some communication from Shelby County, at least initially, about the interim review, that you had to have an overall score of a 3 in order to be considered on track for renewal. After that communication, I believe it was a webinar, there was an email sent out to the schools who were undergoing their interim review, which was City University Girls, that the standard was changing from an overall of a 3 to be on track for renewal to you had to have a 3 in each of
category.
the 3 areas.
Right.
That in itself was a separate issue from what was going to be required for renewal, for example, for City University boys. So the standard, I think the discussion was more around the interim review standard versus the standard for renewal moving forward. So it was a little confusing. It took us some time to kind of parse through that and figure out what exactly changed.
Okay.
But I think at the end of the day, it wasn't clear. And that is feedback for Shelby County, as you, again, heard me read from the ED report.
Right.
I think it needs to be crystal clear. I think in this case, Shelby County's been working through their own process to change the way they think about evaluating on track for renewal. And again, in this unfortunate case for this school, they got caught in sort of that change. They were one of the first schools to be authorized in Shelby County or then Memphis City. And so they're one of the first to come up potentially for non-renewal. So I think, again, Shelby County's been working through some of their processes in terms of both the threshold for renewal and the communication thereof.
That change occurred or was announced 1 month before the applications were due for renewal. Is that right?
That is my understanding. It was in March and April of 2018 that those things were communicated. March was when it was communicated. April was when the renewal application was due.
Okay. And so City University submitted information showing that in, I don't know if it's in state law or wherever the policy lies, that information should have been announced or shared a year in advance or a year prior to renewal. And it was only shared a month in advance, is that right?
So they talked about a requirement in 4913-121 that says that a year prior to the expiration of the charter agreement, the chartering authority has to provide essentially a performance evaluation that reflects the renewal criteria.
Right.
And so City University's argument was that we did have in the record that there was a letter that was sent from Shelby County to City University boys that, in Shelby County's opinion, did provide a renewal evaluation. It provided some data, and I think it attached their renewal or their annual report. But in City University's argument was this didn't directly reflect the standard within which you were going to apply for our renewal, because that, as you said, wasn't communicated to them until March. And that standard itself was that you had to have a 3 in each area in order to be considered for renewal.
And so that point, does that not go to the heart of number 2, where if you're going to hold me to a performance expectation, and that performance expectation was not adequately, clearly, or it seems to be questioned, if at all, communicated to me, not even just a year in advance, but if at all, seems to be a question mark, then does that not go to the heart of number 2 in terms of the foundation of Shelby County's argument?
Angie, you can explain this better, but my interpretation is number 2 is really talking about the charter agreement. So it's that 80% threshold that was in the application, and then also the agreement itself in terms of what the school was setting forth as their goals. But Angie.
Yeah, that's correct. And part
as
of
opposed
it,
to the threshold for renewal, if that makes sense.
it's kind of twofold. I think it's both. It's the standards that were set forth in the charter agreement, but then the charter agreement also had this accountability plan, which was developed by Shelby County, albeit not until 2017, I believe, that set forth at least their performance framework. And these standards within which they're evaluating the school are based on their performance framework.
And so I was reading at the hearing, it seemed like someone referenced that the performance framework had not been officially yet approved by the school board. Is that right?
I believe that is their renewal policy.
Okay.
So they, as Sarah said, have been working really closely with the National Association of Charter School Authorizers to get a tighter kind of policy and procedure in place around renewals now that they're coming up on all of these. So I believe it was approved on first reading and has not been finally approved yet, but Shelby County did make the point that this cycle was operated essentially under the language of that draft policy.
Okay. Is the framework separate from the renewal policy?
Yes, I have reviewed what the board approved in terms of policy. It's by reference. It's not included within the policy itself, the framework that we're talking about.
So were they evaluating these renewals under a process approved by the Shelby County School Board?
They evaluated it under this draft. It's essentially the procedures that they had in place prior to it being fully approved. So the policy itself hasn't been approved, but this is the process by which they operated. So yes, they said that this isn't a fully approved policy yet, but this is how they ran their process.
That doesn't make sense.
They ran the process under the policy, although the policy hasn't been approved finally by their board.
So the school in Shelby entered into an agreement. As the anniversary date, and that agreement had stipulations in it that we're talking about now. And the anniversary date rolls around and Shelby wants to terminate that agreement. But it has not formally adopted by its board of directors the standards by which it's going to use to terminate that agreement. Is that?
I mean, I believe that's correct. But Angie, in terms of what the law allows for charter authorizers, they can terminate the agreement at any time short of having a policy in place. So I think my understanding is Shelby County is really working towards best practice by putting a policy in place that makes it very clear. I mean, this is what we want to see all authorizers doing. But they are within the realm of the law to terminate that agreement at any time if there is failure to meet the expectations laid out in that agreement, which are the three things they're listed, one of which is the academic performance. But again, the points that you all are bringing up are really important because Shelby County is in the very early stages of putting this in place officially, which again is what we'd like to see. But it is problematic for this school in terms of being one of the first to come through, I think, in terms of the communication and the rollout of this policy, whether it was in the draft form or officially adopted by the board.
So there appeared to be, in the City University appeal, a statement that the charter agreement should supersede the charter application. What's different relative to City University's performance expectations in the charter agreement compared to the charter application?
So the charter application incorporates by reference the charter agreement incorporates by reference the application. And as Tess said, it is required by law that happen. So it doesn't supersede the charter application. The application doesn't go away when you enter into a charter agreement. So some of the goals, for example, that we were talking about earlier that City University Boys set for themselves in their charter agreement were incorporated in that part of their application.
Are there different performance expectations than in the charter application?
No, because when the agreement was signed, there was no accountability plan that was created. It hadn't been created yet. And it says in the charter agreement that until the accountability plan is created, that you will be held to the goals that you are outlined in your charter application. So when you look and you analyze what's in the charter agreement is a reference to an exhibit that has currently that at that time had not been created at that point. So the only goals actually within the charter agreement are the goals within the application. Fast forward 7 years when Shelby County had gotten to a point where they were developing a performance framework for all of their charter schools, that then became the accountability plan that was referenced in the original charter agreement.
Okay.
Ms. Tucker.
So these are all issues that I've struggled with too and looked at, and I think, not to give a speech to Shelby County because they don't want a speech from me, but I'm going to give a speech to Shelby County. This could have all been avoided with good communication, with NACSA best practices, period, with all the things that I know that our group, and again, we had one charter to start with, has worked really hard to do because the clear lines weren't there. The communication is a mess. So what I had to do is just go back to the bottom line. And I mean, the bottom line is the school is now almost 10 years old, and these kids have been in the bottom 5%, and then close to the bottom 5%, the bottom 10% all along. And I get that there are schools around it, and Gordon made a good point, that aren't serving kids any better and some even worse. But in my opinion, when you open a charter, part of that agreement is that you will do what you say you're going to do, and like that accountability is high. And so for me, at the end of the day, even though it gives me heartburn because of all this stuff, I mean, the statute is clearly met, in my opinion, by the facts that you guys uncovered in that hearing. And so I don't like that these 89 families or students are going to be displaced and have to find another place, but I also don't like that for almost 10 years that school's been in the bottom of the state. So That's where my head is.
Are there any other questions or comments? Thank you, Tess. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Angie. I know this was a difficult body of work for you all. We appreciate your due diligence, and it's not going to be an easy decision. It's very tough. And as Mr. Eby said, when you're affecting children, it's all about the children. Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item is educator licensure actions. Ms. Brittany Kendrick.
Madam Chair, board members, I'm not by myself today. Hannah McCann, who joined our staff in August of last year, is with me as well.
While you're getting set up, I'll just say welcome to Hannah too officially, because you joined in August, but I was gone in October, so I couldn't officially welcome you. But we're thrilled to have Hannah. She was an intern for us a couple years ago as you were finishing law school. And so we were really excited to get her back full-time working with Brittany on the licensure discipline work. So I'm glad to be here.
So as usual, you all have all of the list of licensure cases that the board staff has recommended. We are happy to take any questions before you all vote tomorrow or discuss and vote tomorrow. We don't have any announcements on our behalf, but if you all have any questions, just let us know.
Ms. Tucker.
You didn't even have to look at me that time. See, I'm trained.
I'm really good
I
at
know,
this.
you're well trained. I don't have questions, but I want to pull three from, and I know in my one-on-one, I had this conversation with staff. I would like to pull K. I believe it's K, N, and V, I believe. Are those the?
Lloyd Mays, Lori Osborne, and
Ashley Wright.
Ashley Wright, yeah.
Yes, those are the three that I want to individually discuss.
Okay. Any others? I said any others besides those? Or any discussion or questions?
Just repeat for me, because I'm sorry, I was busy flipping through papers. K?
Yes, K is Lloyd Mays, N is Lori Osborne, and V is Ashley Wright. And we'll have to save the discussion for tomorrow, the actual
Yes.
meeting, Sarah.
Anyone else? Any other items to be pulled? Well, I was trying to see if it was the same ones.
Lillian, they are.
They are.
Mhm.
Great
We're
mind.
on the same page. How ironic.
K, N, and V is in base.
P is in
The
Paul.
very last one, Ashley Wright.
V is in Virginia.
B is in Virginia.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
sorry.
V.
Okay. That's all you have. I'm stunned. So we're at the end of the workshop.
Thank you, guys.
Are there any, thank you very much. Clearly, you did a lot of work, a lot of research. This is not an easy job. That's why we need two people. Thank you. Anything for the good of the order and for the meeting tomorrow that we need to discuss before we adjourn?
Nothing to discuss, but just on a positive, ending on a positive note, I'm excited tomorrow that we'll be joined by both the Blue Ribbon schools and the Distinguished schools. They'll be with us for the meeting so that we can recognize them as part of our formal proceedings, and then they'll join us afterwards for an informal reception where we can get the chance to talk with some of those incredible school leaders and understand more about the work that they're doing across our state.
Excellent. Without objection, the committee of the whole is dissolved, and the board will stand adjourned, and Nathan will be happy. I'm using my gavel. Thank you all. You're dissolved. Committee of the whole. The committee of the whole is dissolved.